Chapter 787. It had been snowing since last night. Chang'an had turned into a black and white cloth, embroidered with palace eaves, Taoist temples, lakes, and mountains. One of the roads was foggy and gloomy. Ning Ke placed a lot of needles on that area and sewed it tightly. He wanted to sew up those cracks or embroider a new flower so that the dimmed area could regain its brilliance. Unfortunately, he realized it too late. He didn't place enough needles. The Abbey Dean could always find a place to stand and saw him before he fixed the God-stunning array. Ning Ke and the Abbey Dean saw each other from afar, separated by a long street that was covered by wind and snow. The Abbey Dean had been injured while walking through Chang'an. His Taoist robe was stained with blood, but he didn't fall. They didn't meet, but they had already met. The moment they met, the winner had been decided. Ning Ke knew he had lost. Mo Shanshan glanced at him and scattered the stones in the deerskin bag on the street. Then she left. He took the array pestle and held the hilt tightly. If it was in the past, he would have left immediately once he was sure he had failed. But he didn't do that today. It had nothing to do with courage, but confidence. Because he believed that he could win in the end. Because he was in Chang'an. The Abbey Dean glanced at the other end of the street through the snow and wind. The array pestle in Ning Ke's hand suddenly became extremely hot. The place where his palm touched the pestle made a sizzling sound, with green smoke and a pungent smell. This was the first time Ning Ke and the Abbey Dean had really touched each other since the morning. Only with the power of the God-stunning array could he not be controlled by the Abbey Dean's eyes. The power of the God-stunning array spread to the street through the array pestle, protecting his body and mind. The array pestle was a passage, which had endured an unimaginable amount of aura of heaven and earth and rapidly heated up. This kind of burning pain not only fell on his palm, but also fell on his heart. But he still looked calm and said nothing. Since it was hot, he could fight. Even in Chang'an, you are still too weak. The Abbey Dean's voice came from more than 10 miles away, which couldn't be covered by the snow and wind. Ning Ke looked at the other side of the wind and snow and said, "In Chang'an, I know everything, so you have never been able to catch up with me. Now I want to try and see if I can be omnipotent." As soon as he finished speaking, he drew his saber and slashed down. The psyche power in his sense of perception overflowed and spread to all directions of Chang'an and through the array pestle in his hand. It came to the houses in the 365 streets and alleys in the eastern city, to the green bricks and old stones that had weathered countless years of wind and rain, to the 5 lakes in the western city, and to the pavilions and terraces. An ancient and desolate aura spread out from the cracks between the bricks, slowly rising from the depths of the lake covered in ice and snow, and from the depths of the foundations of the pavilions and towers. The old beams creaked, and the limestone slabs produced dust that had accumulated over the years. The hot springs that gushed out from the bottom of the 5 lakes became hotter and hotter. Countless pearl-like bubbles gushed out, and the fish desperately fled in the boiling lake water. If you go, you come back. The God-stunning array sensed the summoning of the psyche power from the array pestle and returned the boundless aura of heaven and earth to the Vermilion Bird Avenue, to the front of him, and to the front of his blade. Ning Ke chopped the city out with one chop. On the snow street, there were countless slash marks. With a sizzling sound, they broke the walls and cut the ground. These slash marks were in pairs, and each pair was a powerful divine talisman. These slash marks condensed the aura of heaven and earth of Chang'an and were extremely powerful. Each slash mark was above the 5 states and blocked the entire Vermilion Bird Avenue. The slash marks were like cutting grass, and killing people was like cutting grass. The eaves and walls were broken, the beams were broken, and the stones and gravel were all shattered. Everything it touched was like withered grass. The slash marks came with the city. The Abbey Dean's indigo robe trembled slightly, and then he disappeared. A slash fell on the street, and with a crisp crack, the limestone slabs were broken. The air on the street was also broken. The Abbey Dean fell back on the street, stepping on the snow. A wound appeared on his left leg. He looked at it, and the bleeding stopped. The wound was as white as jade. Countless slash marks came from the other end of the long street more than a dozen miles away. The Abbey Dean disappeared again and performed the limitless technique in a small space. The slash marks made by Ning Ke carried the aura of Chang and cut him out from the interlayer of the chi of heaven and earth. The Abbey Dean disappeared and reappeared from time to time. When he reappeared, he was at the entrance of the alley, at the workshop gate, and in the shabby yamen. He was like a divine elephant. Every time he reappeared, there would be another wound on his body. He was the most powerful cultivator in Hautian Taoism for 1,000 years, and now the most powerful man in the world. But facing the power of the entire Chang'an, he could only passively defend. Ning Ke wanted to know if he could be omnipotent in Chang'an. At least for now, he seemed to be. The Abbey Dean was cut out from nothingness by the slash marks again. There was a tiny wound on his forehead, right at the end of his eyebrow. The broken eyebrow was like a broken dike, and blood slowly flowed out from the thin line like water overflowing the dike. He looked at the other end of the long street, and his expression gradually became solemn. He suddenly raised his palm and slowly brushed it down in front of him, like an ancient Buddha brushing his face to show his sorrow, or like the face-changing tricks in the Song Kingdom's ancient plays. He wanted to erase the face. The Abbey Dean's slowly falling palm did not erase the blood, nor did it turn the thin line wound into a golden line. It only added a layer of frost to the broken eyebrow and eyelashes. An aura of quietus shrouded his body. At the other end of the long street, another slash came through the snow. The cold wind came first. The Abbey Dean's green sleeves fluttered, and his body expanded in the wind, as if he had become countless times bigger, and was about to break through the sky. In fact, he was still standing on the street, and he was still an ordinary Taoist. But his body gave off an aura as vast and boundless as the sea. Ning Ke's slash marks arrived. They arrived at Chang'an. The aura of heaven and earth changed violently. In the wind and snow on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, there seemed to be countless people crying. In an instant, he was hit by dozens of slash marks. Ning Ke's slash marks were all above the 5 states, and had the power to cut mountains and break rivers. But the Abbey Dean was already quietus. He was emotionless and senseless, without pain or fear. Ning Ke's talisman had the power above the 5 states, and it carried the power of the God-stunning array. On the Vermilion Bird Avenue, it was like the raging waves on the sea of the Kingdom of Song. But the Abbey Dean was already boundless. Both his aura and his body were as vast as the ocean. No matter how powerful the slash marks were, they could only cut a person who did not feel pain. No matter how horrifying the raging waves were, they fell into the ocean and were just a corner of the picture. Quietus and boundless. The Abbey Dean used 2 powers above the 5 states at the same time, and made the 2 become a perfect combination. The wind and snow calmed down again. The Abbey Dean walked forward calmly. Ning Ke's slash marks only left some tiny marks on his body. Some of his eyelashes fell, some of his clothes were cut, and some of his cloth shoes were cut. Other than that, there were no other wounds. Ning Ke looked at the approaching Abbey Dean and said, "So you are a flying ant. I wish everyone a happy holiday." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 788. At the bottom of the giant sinkhole in the western wilderness lived many serfs. They served the monks in the Xiankong temple and maintained the existence of that society. In Haotian's eyes, human beings living on the ground were actually serfs. They were like ants, repeating their boring lives without complaint. However, there were always some unique ants in the ant colony who, for various reasons or no reason, decided to temporarily look away from the rotten leaves and soil to the blue sky. Seeing the blue sky would greatly change the lives of those ants. Some ants yearned for it because they saw it, some were angry because the sky was far away, and some were afraid because they saw it. They trembled and surrendered to the soil, feeling grateful for the gift from the sky. But no matter what the ending was, those ants were no longer ordinary ants. In a sense, they had already left the category of ants because they could fly. The headmaster and Kuharan were undoubtedly the two most incredible flying ants in countless years. Ning Kai said that the Abbey Dean was a flying ant. He was not mocking him, but expressing his respect. Actually, there is something I have never understood. Abbey Dean, you have already transcended the mortal world and your vision is no longer in the human world. Then why don't you look at the blue sky again? Ning Kai looked at the end of the long street and asked seriously. The ideas of Haotian Taoism and the academy have never been interlinked. The headmaster and I have different ideas. Every beginning must have an end, and every cycle must have an end. That is the real cycle. The Abbey Dean's voice came from the wind and snow. Just like Chang'an, which the headmaster left in the human world. It is isolated from the heaven. No matter how powerful it is just a pool of stagnant water. Just like the talisman you are writing now. It is ferocious but has no way to return. So it is not perfect and has no choice. Then how can it stop me? Ning Kai looked at the wind and snow and said, no choice. Isn't that freedom? The Abbey Dean said, no choice doesn't mean no choice. The aura and the array kept colliding. Countless thin and sharp lines appeared on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. The sound of bubbles bursting could be heard from time to time. The snow remnant talisman was broken. The Abbey Dean's voice came closer in the wind and snow. Even with the support of the God-stunning array, you are too weak to defend the city. According to your temperament, you should have fled a few days ago, but you're still on the street. This is a bit surprising. Teacher left this city to me, so I can only stay here. If I had understood it earlier, perhaps I would have repaired the God-stunning array 2 days ago. Ning Kai said, it's a pity that she has stayed in Chang'an for too long these years. I'm too lazy and let her do everything. As a result, she has been to too many places and left too much aura. From this point of view, the danger in Chang'an is our responsibility. You're right. If it were in the past, I would have escaped from Chang'an a long time ago. But since it's her and my responsibility, and she's dead now, I have no choice but to stay and shoulder it. Because she's my wife, I have to pay for it. The Abbey Dean knew who he was talking about and said, even though you know you can't defend it? Because we know, we have to defend. Even if we know we can't defend, we still have to defend. Ning Kai said, this is my Ji show. After saying this, he looked at the figure in the wind and snow that was getting clearer and clearer. He clenched the hilt with both hands, slightly bent his left knee, and tightened his body like a bow. Then he swung the blade down. He knew what the Abbey Dean said was right. He hadn't found that word yet, so he couldn't perfectly mobilize the God-stunning array. The only divine talisman he knew before was the 2 horizontal talisman, which represented cutting and absolute stubbornness. But it also represented the parallel opposition, and it was difficult to connect with the surrounding heaven and earth. Last night, he comprehended the talisman of E. The 2 parallel lines intersected and began to connect, so he could borrow the power of heaven and earth in the God-stunning array and possess the power of one of the 5 states. But the 4 corners of the 2 lines gradually drifted away from each other, unable to be recycled and could only gradually overflow. But he still wanted to give it a try, because he didn't believe that anyone could really fight against this 1,000-year-old city. The 2 blades broke through the wind and snow, whistling more and more fiercely. The Abbey Dean looked calm. He once again brushed his face with his palm. His indigo robe fluttered, and his aura soared to the sky. The perfect combination of immeasurability and quietus allowed him to integrate this war into another dimension. The array eye pestle in Ning Kai's hand was as hot as the lava in a volcano. He looked at the floating figure of the Abbey Dean on the other side of the street, and the psyche power in his body kept flowing out. The lake water was boiling, and the indigo bricks were trembling. The chi of heaven and earth in the entire Chang'an city seemed to be summoned by Ning Kai to the Vermilion Bird Avenue, and rushed toward the Abbey Dean. The sky above Chang and city suddenly cleared up. The snow clouds that had been lingering since last night disappeared in a very short time, and the blue sky was revealed. The power of a city bombarded the Abbey Dean's body. Almost at the same time, countless thunders fell from the sky and bombarded the city. The Abbey Dean's figure was indistinct in the wind and thunder. The anger of Haotian and the power of the human world collided with each other through the bodies of the Abbey Dean and Ning Quebec. There was no falling snow, but there was the sound of falling snow. It was a blizzard. There was no wind, but there was the sound of howling wind. The entire Chang and city was shrouded in the violent collision of the chi of heaven and earth, and the walls of countless buildings were shaken and cracked. No other sound could be heard except the horrible sound of the wind and snow. The wind and snow gradually stopped, and some of the scattered clouds came back. The sun above Chang and city was a little dim. The Vermilion Bird Avenue was quiet, and the Abbey Dean and Ning Kei stood opposite each other. The distance between them was no longer more than 10 miles, but only a few dozen feet. Ning Kei could clearly see the Abbey Dean's face. He saw the scars on the Abbey Dean's face, the broken eyebrow and fingers. The Abbey Dean walked toward him. The round pebbles on the street rustled and moved to the sides. Ning Kei lowered his head and coughed. He seemed to be in great pain, and blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. Then he suddenly looked up at the Abbey Dean, and punched without warning. His eyes were very calm, and therefore very cruel. He was like a young male tiger staring at its prey on the grassland. He stood where he was and waved his fist. His fist came to the Abbey Dean's face more than 100 feet away. Since he started cultivating the Great Spirit into the devil, his body and strength had become more and more terrifying. Therefore, he never worried about close combat. He had been waiting for the Abbey Dean to come to him. The fist contained the majestic Great Spirit, like a tiger's claw in the night. It was sharp and deadly. The Abbey Dean raised his palm and held Ning Kei's fist. Ning Kei's fist could break down a small building. But when it hit the Abbey Dean's palm, it was like hitting the big swamp in the depths of the wilderness, or falling into the sea. Even Yu Lian's fist could not threaten the Abbey Dean, let alone Ning Kei's. The Abbey Dean smiled. The array pestle in Ning Kei's left hand suddenly shone brightly. The chi of heaven and earth in Chang and city all poured into his body through the array pestle and burst out from his fist. I'll go to Hangzhou tomorrow for the annual meeting. I didn't ask for leave, so there will be an update. Also, I want to discuss with everyone that it's okay to scold me these days. I'll try my best to pretend to be blind. After a few days, they probably won't scold me anymore. But please don't scold my family and the sub-editors. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 789. Thunder roared on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. The Abbey Dean and Ning Kei's fists and palms collided. Countless auras burst out from their bodies and shot out in all directions. Wherever they touched, bricks and stones were destroyed, beams and trees were broken, and houses along the street collapsed. An unimaginable majestic power smashed into the Abbey Dean's palm from Ning Kei's fist. He was like a bridge that connected Chang and city and the Abbey Dean. The violent chi of heaven and earth rushed out from his bones and flesh, putting him under a great burden. He was suffering. His joints cracked, his eyelashes were slightly burnt, and his body trembled violently. Blood kept flowing out from his lips and fell on the snow. But he was smiling. The Abbey Dean's palm had 3 broken fingers, which were as clean as jade. At this moment, the fingers suddenly burst and blood seeped out. Then, 3 streams of blood shot out and fell on the snow. The smile on his face froze, but it did not fade away. A snowflake floated in front of his eyes and swept past his eyelashes. The color of his pupils gradually faded. Or in other words, the color of the snowflake began to darken. It was gray. The Abbey Dean's eyes turned gray, like the haze above the abyss. This was the second time that his eyes turned gray today. It was the second time that he used the secret method of Haotian Taoism, gray eyes. The secret method of Haotian Taoism, the gray eyes, was specially used to suck the psyche power and spirit of cultivators. It was very evil and horrible. Prince Long Qing learned this method from the Sha hand scroll of the Tomes of Arcane, and then absorbed the peerless power of the half-man Taoist. That was how he became a powerhouse in the wilderness from a useless person. The Abbey Dean's gray eyes were tens of thousands of times more powerful than Long Qing's. Facing his gray eyes, which were like the bottom of a dry well, even someone as strong as Yu Lian felt angry and scared. What could Ning Ke do? He felt the horrible sucking power like a black vortex on the Abbey Dean and the wind blowing on his cheeks. His expression did not change, and he was calm as usual. He did nothing, because the Abbey Dean's gray eyes did not affect him at all. Both the psyche power in his sense of perception and the great spirit in his chest stayed where they were. The Abbey Dean could not take away any aura from him, not even the smell. The Abbey Dean raised his eyebrows. Ning Ke took a deep breath and his chest puffed up like a war flag being blown by the strong wind. The cold wind and snow in front of him were all sucked into his lungs. The blood that spurted out from the Abbey Dean's severed finger turned into a bloody mist and was sucked into his mouth. There were some blood stains on the corner of his lips. Apart from his own, the rest belonged to the Abbey Dean. This scene looked very strange. Ning Ke knew that he was no match for the Abbey Dean, even if he had Chang and behind him. From the very beginning, he never expected to defeat his opponent. He only hoped that he could fix the array of the astonished gods. That was why he was spotted by the Abbey Dean even though he was walking on the street. That was why he waved his blade and cut the talismans on the snowy street. He fought from afar and only wanted to keep the enemy more than 10 miles away. All these signs clearly showed his fear, which could not escape the Abbey Dean's eyes. Therefore, the Abbey Dean smiled calmly and approached him step by step. In fact, this was exactly what Ning Ke needed. In a large-scale battle with the city of heaven and earth as the battlefield, he could not find any chance to defeat the Abbey Dean. On the contrary, if he was close enough, he might find a glimmer of hope in despair. Because he was good at close combat. After joining the devil, his body was as hard as stone and he had terrifying strength. Most importantly, he had the array pestle in his hand. In the morning, he saw the battle between the Abbey Dean and third sister by the Yanming Lake. The gray eyes was a secret skill of Haotian Taoism. But Ning Ke knew this skill very well because he had fought with Long Qing outside the Red Lotus Temple. The gray eyes came from the practice of Tao Tai of the Devil's Doctrine. The practice of Tao Tai had been lost for a long time. After Lotus died, there was only one person in the world who could use the practice of Tao Tai. That was Ning Quebec. And only Yi Hongyu and Sang Sang knew about it. So he had been giving the Abbey Dean a chance to get close. He was waiting for him to get close. Looking at the Abbey Dean calmly walking toward him, he was nervous and expectant. Seeing the Abbey Dean's eyes turn gray, he became excited and happy. The gray eyes had no effect on him. His Tao Tai began to be released. Like the greedy monster in the legend, it desperately swallowed everything in front of it. The cold wind filled with snowflakes and the mist of blood entered his mouth. At this moment, he seemed to have become a flesh-eating beast, sucking the Abbey Dean's blood and psyche power and spirit desperately. He even forgot to breathe. A faint red passageway appeared between him and the Abbey Dean. The Abbey Dean's abundant psyche power and spiritual aura quickly disappeared through the passageway and entered his body. Ning Ke's face was flushed, like a drunken man or the morning glow. His eyes were as bright as a golden pond, which was about to swallow the figure of the Abbey Dean. He clearly felt that a pure and clean aura, like water, kept flowing into his ocean of qi and mountain of snow, cleansing his body. He knew that was the most essential aura of the Abbey Dean. The practice of Tao Tai was far more powerful than the gray eyes. Once it was used, it was almost irreversible. Ning Ke looked at the Abbey Dean, who was close at hand, and smiled. It seemed that he was about to usher in an impossible victory. However, in the next moment, his smile stiffened. Because the Abbey Dean was still smiling. The Abbey Dean's spirit and psyche power were disappearing at a terrifying speed, but he was still smiling. His eyes were no longer gray, but as calm as a lake, with a hint of mockery. His smile was still calm, as if he knew all the changes in the world. Ning Ke suddenly felt that the water-like aura turned into ice. It was not just a psychological change, but something that actually happened in the objective reality. The aura that washed his snow mountain, ocean of chi, and bone marrow like clear water suddenly turned into ice. Now it turned into countless ice shards and snowflakes, covering every part of his body. It was not because of the practice of Tao Tai that the Abbey Dean's aura changed. It was because another aura of the Abbey Dean was swallowed into his body. It was an aura of absolute quietus. Heat was a kind of movement. Coldness was the reduction of the intensity of movement. Quietus would bring absolute coldness. Looking at the Abbey Dean, Ning Ke knew that he was wrong. Any fighting awareness was meaningless in front of a huge gap in strength. Even if he used Tao Tai to fight back the gray eyes, he could not fight back as long as the Abbey Dean gave him a wisp of quietus above the 5 states. His body suddenly became stiff and cold, and he could not move. The snow fell on his face, as if it would never melt. His sense of perception began to freeze. His body and mind became a cold and dead world. He was connected with Chang'an, but he still could not break this world of quietus. Even the whole Chang'an city began to freeze. I was on the way today. I took a plane to a train and arrived in Hangzhou at night. I wrote this chapter last night. I hope the journey is smooth and not too tiring. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 790. The sky was clear for thousands of miles, but snow suddenly fell. This was what it meant to be 10,000 miles of snow. Heavy snowflakes flew in the air like ashes after burning reeds. They occupied the entire sky and covered the color of the blue sky. The temperature in the city dropped sharply. The icicles on the eaves were so cold that the lake was cracking. The water in the well at the entrance of the alley began to freeze. Ning Ke stood in the wind and snow. His black academy uniform was covered with thick snow. He was like a bridge made of snow that could break at any time due to the weight of too much snow. In this battle, he was the bridge. Chang'an City used his blade to attack the Abbey Dean. At this moment, the Abbey Dean's quietus was swallowed by Tao Tai and entered Ning Ke's body. Through the array pestle, the quietus was magnified or concretized and covered Chang'an City. The coldness of the snowflakes penetrated the thick academy uniform and reached Ning Ke's skin. The frost on his eyelashes and the snow on his face were so thick that he looked like Sang Sang when she put on makeup for the first time. It was so cold that all movement stopped. Ning Ke, who was occupied by the quietus, felt like he had fallen into the deepest ice cellar. He was so cold that he couldn't tremble or breathe. Even his mind was about to be frozen. He was frozen like the well at the entrance of the alley. At this moment, only the drop of crystal-clear liquid in his abdomen was still rotating slowly, although it had become extremely slow and could stop at any time. The aura of the drop of liquid had the pride of breaking through all restraints, whether it was coldness or quietus. At this moment, his sense of perception had become an ocean covered with ice and snow. Only a fragment was still shining in the bottom of the muddy sea. It was unwilling and violent in the face of the coldness falling from the sky. Ning Ke's great spirit was inherited from youngest uncle, and his fragment of consciousness was inherited from Lotus. Both of them were at the peak of their era, and both of them could compete with the Abbey Dean. At this moment, he was in the greatest danger of his life. At the moment when he was closest to death, the great spirit and the fragment of consciousness that had saved him countless times broke out again. Ning Ke suddenly began to tremble. The frost on his eyelashes and the snowflakes on his face were broken and then shot away like sharp arrows, revealing his true face. A mouthful of blood spurted from his lips and dripped down. The blood was very turbid because there were many blood ice particles that had been frozen by the low temperature. The murky blood dripped onto his clothes and onto his left hand. The array eye pestle suddenly became hot after being splashed with the blood. The blood evaporated into steam and blew past his face. Ning Ke let out a cry, appearing to be in extreme pain. The ice armor on his black academy uniform was shattered, like snow being brushed off a stone bridge, revealing his true appearance. He suddenly opened his eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he exerted his strength to break through the ice and snow. Then, he let go of the saber. He had to seize this moment of awakening. He held the two ends of the array eye pestle with both hands and swept it horizontally in front of him in the snowstorm. Two lines were drawn in a single sweep, two perfectly parallel lines. The fierce talisman intent suddenly burst out in the wind and snow. Two horizontal character. Under the cover of talisman intent, Ning Ke stepped on the ice and snow, leaped backward and rushed dozens of feet away. The Abbey Dean had proven that he was invincible. Even though he had a city, he was still no match for him. He had almost died from a single glance. Therefore, all he wanted to do now was to leave. The further he stayed away from the other party, the better. On the Vermilion Bird Avenue, two fierce talisman intents appeared, like two refined sharp blades. The Abbey Dean raised his right arm and pointed with his finger. Know the masculinity and defend the femininity, known as the stream of the world. Know the black and defend the white, known as the style of the world. Know the glory and defend the humiliation, known as the valley of the world. The Abbey Dean used the finger of the world. The finger intent completely ignored the two talismans on the snow street and flew away. Ning Ke was still moving backward, and a bloody hole appeared on his knee. He fell backward, and a bloody hole appeared on his shoulder. After several soft sounds, 7 bloody holes appeared on his body. The Abbey Dean used 7 fingers, which coincided with the will of heaven, to cut off humanity. To cut off one's way of survival. Fresh blood flowed out and stained the white snow under Ning Quebec. At this moment, he could only sit in an extremely ugly posture and had no strength to wield his blade. The Abbey Dean said, "Ingenuity is a small skill." Ning Ke understood that the Abbey Dean was commenting on the previous battle. He had to admit that the Abbey Dean was right. No matter if it was showing weakness or luring the enemy to get close, it was not a great way for a real battle. Your current state is still far from the real great way. No matter how strong your desire is, it can't make up for it, not to mention that you have taken a wrong path. The Abbey Dean walked slowly, and the wind and snow parted him. I have seen your calligraphy. It is different from others. I don't like it, because you don't know how to use a clumsy brush. And that word is too heavy, so you have to use a clumsy brush. Ning Ke raised his arm with some difficulty and wiped off the blood on his chin. He said, "If there is a chance in the future, I will remember your teachings and learn how to use a clumsy brush." There is no future. The Abbey Dean sensed 2 figures coming at a high speed in the wind and snow behind him. He knew that they were the powerful senior brother and sister from the academy. He didn't care. The whole city had been frozen by him. What could the people in the city do? Not far from the west of the Vermilion Bird Avenue, there was a plain or even shabby house. It was a common scene in Chang'an. Usually, there would be an old house that had not been maintained for hundreds of years next to an official's office. Prosperity and shabbiness always coexisted, and it was hard to tell whether it was good or bad. This street was called Sanyuanli, where the most common people in Chang'an lived. In a woodshed in the backyard of one of the houses, a young man's angry voice was suddenly heard, accompanied by the sound of slapping the table. Why only a pot of hot water? Why only a pot of hot water? It's not enough. My mother's feet are frozen, so I can't take a bath. And that guy always has a black face. Who is he showing it to? The woman was sitting in a pile of bedding, holding a 3 or 4 years old girl. She looked at her angry son with a worried expression and said, "We have a place to live and food to eat. It's good." The young man was wearing a shabby cotton-padded jacket. Judging from his appearance, he should be a country boy. He sat at the door of the woodshed, which was the most leaky. Akiji's face had turned blue from the cold wind. He said angrily, "It's just an extra pot of hot water. How hard can it be? It was very cold today." Icicles hung on the eaves, and even the heat from the kitchen could not drift far. The young man was worried about his mother's cold feet, so he asked for hot water from the front yard. But he only brought back a pot and was scolded by the young man in the front yard. He was in a bad mood when he thought of what had happened today. At this moment, the door of the woodshed was pushed open. A young man appeared at the door. He was wearing a tight cotton-padded jacket and looked a little relaxed and arrogant. It seemed that he had been hanging around in the streets for a long time. The cold wind came in through the door, and the woman began to cough. But she did not care about herself. She hugged the little girl in her arms tightly and pulled the bedding over the little girl. The country boy looked at the city boy angrily, but he clenched his fists and did not dare to make a move. Because the city boy had 2 knives in his hands. One was a chopper, and the other was a kitchen knife. I finished writing this chapter in the cafe by the broken bridge of West Lake. I want to argue with anyone who calls me petty bourgeois. It's really not good. The tables and chairs are not good. The shoulders and neck are not good. The wind on the lake is not good. It's good that I wrote it in the afternoon. Amitba. I'm looking forward to going home. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 791. Since the beginning of the war, the Tang Empire had been burning everywhere. The most tragic place was the northern frontier. The cavalry of the Golden Tribe Royal Court from the wilderness had been fighting with the northern battlefront army. Endless blood had been shed for every ranch and every town. The most tragic place was the eastern frontier. The northeast border military of the Tang Empire had been ambushed by the Yen Army and the Eastern Wilderness Cavalry in the capital city of Qingjing. Although they had made the enemy pay a heavy price, they had no more soldiers to use after this battle. The border was wide open, and the invaders' horses trampled on the fertile soil. The most dangerous place was the southern frontier. The Qinghe prefecture had rebelled and General Su Shi had died. The southern battlefront army had rushed back from thousands of miles away, but it was too late. The disciples of the academy had fought against thousands of enemies and were all seriously injured. The main force of the West Hill Divine Palace could break through the verdant canyon at any time and enter the central area. The Wei and Si River valleys, the richest and most central area of the Tang Empire, had not been affected by the war yet. The Tang Empire, which was famous for its efficiency, had begun preparing for the worst situation a few days ago. The stored food from all counties had been sent to Chang'an by caravans. At the same time, they had begun to evacuate people. People in the suburbs of the capital had already been evacuated into the city. Although the evacuation was carried out in an orderly manner and the evacuated people were not that miserable, they were still refugees of the war and could not enjoy a good life. Hundreds of thousands of refugees who had entered Chang'an chose to stay with their relatives and friends. Those who had no relatives or friends in the city were forced to stay with the families in the city by the prefectural magistrate. Haichuan County of Tianbao Prefecture was very close to Chang'an. The young man from the countryside, his mother and younger sister were from Haichuan, but they had no relatives or friends in the city. Therefore, they were arranged to stay with a family in Sanyuanli, which was close to the Vermilion Bird Avenue and usually had spare rooms. This arrangement was more appropriate. The young man from the countryside had been living in this family for several days. Every day, he had 2 hot meals to eat. Although he was living in a woodshed, and the master had brought several blankets, he was still living under someone else's roof after all. There were many inconveniences. Who wouldn't miss the hot kong, pickled vegetables, and fatty meat at home? This was the arrangement of the imperial court, and the government had promised that all expenses would be refunded afterwards. At such a critical moment, this family in Chang'an would not have any objections. However, the sudden addition of 3 refugees in their family inevitably made them feel inconvenient, especially the young man from Chang'an, who was even more dissatisfied. The young man from the countryside had long been resentful of the attitude of the young man from the city. He thought to himself that if it were not for the fact that the farmers had been frugal enough to send food to Chang'an, they would have already starved to death. The woman understood her son's feelings very well, but she still persuaded him to live in Chang'an. At least he would have hot food to eat, a place to live, and no need to worry about being hurt by those barbarians. What kind of life could he expect? The country kids had been persuaded, but the sudden snowfall last night had caused the temperature in Chang'an to drop since the morning. By now, it was unbearably cold. He went to the front yard to ask the host for some hot water, but unexpectedly the young man was stingy and only gave him 1 pot, and did not want to give more. Thinking about his mother's cold legs, he could not suppress his anger. He didn't expect that before he could find trouble with that guy had already barged into the woodshed. "Zhang-san, what are you doing?" The country kid looked at the guy with 2 knives and looked a little nervous. He thought that the other party really had some evil intentions, so he did not dare to resist. Instead, he quietly moved his feet backward and reached out his right hand to the bench next to the brazier. He silently swore in his heart, "If the other party really wants to bully me, then I'll fight." He brought the bench from Haichuan village. It was made of solid hardwood and varnished. It was very heavy and sturdy. When he was a child, he was laughed at for having many fathers. He once tried to fight with this bench and used 3 village children to open their heads. It proved that this bench was very useful. The city kid who had barged into the woodshed with 2 knives was indeed surnamed Zhang, but naturally could not be called Zhang-san. His real name was Zhang Mianzu, and he was not ranked 3rd. "Li Si, I have something to talk to you about." Zhang-san looked at the country kid and said. The country kid's surname was Li, and his name was Li Guangdi. He was not ranked 4th. The way the 2 teenagers called each other was actually a continuation of the mutual ridicule and bickering from a few days ago. Li Guangdi looked at Zhang Mianzu's hand with vigilance. But the next moment, he found that the situation was not what he had imagined, because Zhang Mianzu's hand was trembling and his face was a little pale. Li Guangdi looked down on cowardly and useless city kids, but after fighting so many times these days, he knew that Zhang Mianzu was not that kind of person. Whether it was a murder or a threat, Zhang Mianzu would not turn pale. Because it was obviously because he was scared. Zhang Mianzu looked at Li Guangdi and said, "I saw a monster." His face was pale, and the kitchen knife and chopper in his hand were trembling violently. There was even a sound of wind. Zhang Mianzu swallowed with some difficulty, looked at Li Guangdi and continued saying, "My family is very afraid, and no one dares to fight that monster on the street, but I want to try." Li Guangdi was a little confused and asked, "What monster?" Zhang Mianzu said, "A guy in cyan clothes, with only 2 fingers on his left hand, but he can walk half a street with 1 step, and he can summon the wind and rain. He is a monster no matter how I look at it." Hearing this, Li Guangdi knew what he was talking about, and his face suddenly became ugly. Since a few days ago, the Chang'an local government, the shops, and the men of the Fish Dragon gang had issued warnings to every family and yard. Although he lived in the woodshed with his mother and younger sister, he also knew what would happen today. The morning snow fell, and there was no smoke. Chang'an City seemed to be empty today, but in fact, everyone was nervously and uneasily waiting for the result of the war at home. Li Guangdi woke up very early. He stood in the snowstorm in the backyard and saw many scenes that he had only heard of in stories and legends. He saw the cracks in the snow clouds, he saw countless bolts of lightning falling from the sky, he saw the rain that fell in the middle of winter, and he also saw the burning clouds. He was very afraid, so he stopped watching and began to complain to his mother about the lack of hot water, trying to suppress his fear with his hatred for the boy in the city in the front yard. Although he was just a teenager, he was a Tang. He felt that this kind of fear was very shameful. Li Guangdi never thought that Zhang Mianzu would be so daring to peep at the battle on the street. Thinking back to his previous fear, he felt his face burning up. Why are you telling me this? In order to hide his shame, he glared fiercely at Zhang Mianzu. Zhang Mianzu really didn't like hearing his Haichuan accent, but thinking about what he was going to do next, he suppressed the urge to make fun of him and swallowed the saliva that kept gushing out of nervousness. That green-robed demon is very terrifying. Even the teacher from the academy can't beat him. He said, I'm ready to go, but the old men in the front yard are too timid. They don't dare to go with me, and they won't let me go. I think you at least have some courage. Do you dare to go with me? Li Guangdi asked, what for? Zhang Mianzu said, go and help. Li Guangdi asked, how? Zhang Mianzu raised the two knives in his hands and said, chopper and kitchen knife, you choose first. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 792. Li Guangdi was stunned. He looked at the two knives in his opponent's hands and did not know what to say. Zhang Mianzu said anxiously, we are about to lose. What are you doing here? The woman finally understood and was scared. She said, you are so young. What can you do to help? Zhang Mianzu waved the knife in his hand and said, if you have a knife, you can cut people. I have seen many duels in Chang'an and blood. I know how to cut people. Li Guangdi hesitated and looked back at his mother. He did not have a father since he was a child and was very filial to his mother. Even when his mother gave birth to a younger sister, he did not change his attitude towards his mother. Zhang Mianzu was a little angry and said, country people are really cowards. After saying this, he turned around and walked out of the courtyard. Li Guangdi stopped him and took out a steel fork from the corner of the woodshed. He walked out and said, when I was shooting at the melon fields, you didn't even dare to kill watermelons. Zhang Mianzu looked at him and said happily, Li Si, I was right about you. The wind and snow were furious and it was extremely cold. The street was covered with thick snow. Chang'an had been frozen. The Vermilion Bird Avenue was as quiet as the bottom of a snow lake. There was no sound except for a few coughs deep in the snow. Eldest brother was coughing on the other side of the wind and snow. When Ning Ke failed to attack the city and was about to be killed by the Abbey Dean, he could not wait anymore. So he came to the wind and snow with third sister Yu Lian. Ning Ke had not been able to isolate the Abbey Dean from Haotian's world with Chang'an. This was definitely not the opportunity that Yu Lian had been waiting for. So they failed again. The Abbey Dean walked to Ning Ke on the other side of the street. His injuries were more serious and he began to cough. But his footsteps were still steady. He stepped on the thick snow on the street and only left light footprints. The shops on the side of the street were closed. The marketplace not far away was as quiet as a tomb. Ning Ke sat on the snowy street, covered with blood. The snow under him was dyed red. It was difficult for him to stand up. Zhang Mianzu and Li Guangdi hid in a house. They looked at the situation on the street through the crack of the door. The weather was too cold at this time. The snowflakes fell on their faces and bodies, as if they were frozen. The two youths had been peeping for a while now, but they didn't do anything. It wasn't because they were frozen, but because they felt very lonely and afraid. There was not a single person in the alley. The whole world was so quiet. They had no helpers. They did not see the hooligans who usually ran amok in the streets, the wanderers who were usually envious of, the Yulin royal guards who were idolized by all the Tangs, and the cultivators from the Southern Gate Temple. They could only see each other's pale faces and nervous and fearful eyes. They were brave, but after all, they were just ordinary teenagers. When they saw the master of the academy being defeated by the green-clothed monster, the fear that had been diluted by their hot blood once again occupied their bodies and minds. What should we do? Zhang Mianzu's voice was a little trembling. It sounded like he would cry the next moment. But he thought that it was his own suggestion and he didn't want to be looked down upon by the country kids, so he forced himself to hold it in. Li Guangdi was relatively calm, but his pale face revealed his true feelings. He looked at the green-clothed Taoist walking on the snowy street like an immortal through the crack of the door. He said in a trembling voice, "I'll listen to you." Zhang Mianzu wanted to swallow his saliva to calm down, but found that because he was too nervous and afraid, his lips and tongue were extremely dry. There was no saliva at all. He couldn't help but feel ashamed. Shame was the most real source of courage, especially for the Tangs. Zhang Mianzu grabbed a handful of snow and stuffed it into his mouth. He chewed randomly and said, "I'll go first." Because there was snow in his mouth, and because his voice was a little muffled, Li Guangdi didn't hear it clearly. The next moment, he suddenly saw Zhang Mianzu kick open the wooden door and run to the snowy street with a knife. Only then did he understand what had happened. He quickly grabbed the melon fork and followed. When he arrived on the snowy street and saw the green-clothed monster, the courage that Zhang Mianzu had gained from the stimulation of the ice and snow suddenly disappeared. His arms were limp and powerless, and the kitchen knife and hatchet in his hands were dragged behind his body. His posture was very comical, but he still ran. "Monster, give me your life!" he shouted. Li Guangdi carried the melon fork and rushed behind him. His face was paler than the snow on the street. His arms kept shaking, and it seemed that the fork would fall to the ground at any time. "F***CKU!" he shouted. They didn't know who the green-clothed Taoist was, nor did they know who his mother was. But they knew that he was a monster that even the master of the academy couldn't defeat, so they knew that he was very scary. They were afraid, but they still rushed over. Because they had a breath in their chest and abdomen. They probably didn't know what that breath was, because they had no strength. But they knew that if they didn't rush over, they would look down on themselves. Chang'an was silent in the wind and snow. The Abbey Dean was invincible. At this moment, two teenagers from Sanyuanli rushed out with a kitchen knife and a hatchet, and a steel fork that was used to guard the melon fields. Their voices were very shaky, and it sounded like they were crying. They cried and rushed to the unimaginable enemy. The scene looked funny. But it was not funny. Chang'an was quiet, but of course there were people. In the streets under the morning snow, countless eyes were watching the movements on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. The Abbey Dean knew it very well. Walking in the snow, he could clearly feel the hostility behind the door cracks. He didn't care, because although this war was happening in the human world, it had already gone beyond the scope of the human world. No ordinary people were qualified to participate in this war. The fact that the Academy and the Tang Imperial Court didn't use any military power in today's war was proof. So when he saw the two teenagers rushing to him with knives and forks in their hands, he was a little surprised. The Abbey Dean's expression froze, and then he understood and calmed down like the snow melting. He looked at the two teenagers and smiled. It was not mockery, but pity. But there was no respect either, because that was the value of the secular world. He was the spokesperson of Haotian. He looked at the two youths as though he was looking at ants on the ground from a high and mighty Haotian. The struggle of ants would not make Haotian feel too much, but only interesting. There was another person on the snow street. Ning Ke, who was sitting in the blood snow, changed his expression slightly. There was a subtle change in his expression. It was not a small change. It was a sudden change. Looking at the two teenagers, he realized that there was such a thing as meaning in the world. What he had done for Chang'an was meaningful. In other words, the city of Chang'an and the people living in it were worth working hard for, such as the two pale-faced and staggering youths. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 793. I didn't write today, not because I wasn't feeling well, but because there was a knot in my chest. I can't blame anyone but myself, because the unhappiness of the readers was caused by me. It was entirely my responsibility, and had nothing to do with the weather or my illness. That's why I'll write 2 chapters of 3,000 words tomorrow to fill in what I wrote today. If there are no problems with the inspection the day after tomorrow, I'll try my best to update 2 chapters a day. Below is the main text. Some readers saw the epilogue of other authors and asked me why I had time to drink during the 3 days in Hangzhou and didn't have time to write. I wanted to explain, because it seemed like it was too much. I drank during the first 2 days of the Hangzhou annual conference, so naturally I didn't get drunk. Plus, it was after the update. I didn't drink or play on the day before the update, so I really couldn't write anymore. The request for leave for the 3rd day was still there. I didn't say how sick I was and how uncomfortable it was to ask for leave, because no matter how you looked at it, it would seem like a slut was being unreasonable, and it wouldn't be easy to win people's trust. But in reality, all the authors present knew that my leg had basically recovered, and my right shoulder was basically useless. I shared a room with Special White. In the middle of the night, when I cried out in pain while half asleep, it scared him. But when I woke up the next day, I told him I was fine. Yeah, it hurt like hell for a moment, and then it was King fine for a moment. What could I do? Could I grab my body and say, if you want to hurt, then keep hurting? I suddenly remembered the first day in Hangzhou. Yin Kai had texted me to ask how my body was. My reply was that I was smiling in front of others, but in pain behind them. Today, the reason for my depression was indeed my own problem. I shouldn't have cheerfully said I was fine, and I shouldn't have walked around Westlake in the rain. I should have laid on the bed and sighed. I shouldn't have liked the liveliness of the world, and I did indulge in pleasure and neglect work. After the annual conference, there was supposed to be an event. Before the spring festival, many authors went. At the time, I thought, I really can't go, or else I won't be able to explain it to the readers. Now, it seems that my decision was very wise. Of course, it would be better if I could write more. No matter what, it is a fact that I haven't been updating recently. I apologize again for this. After the inspection, I will resume updating for a long period of time. When everyone calms down and is even happier, I believe that they will laugh when they see that it has been almost a month. Updates are always the way to go. I don't ask for more, but I ask for stability. I understand this, and I will try my best to achieve this. I hope you can give me one more day of patience. I'm a person who needs peace of mind. As long as my body is fine, my mind will be fine and I won't be anxious, because I'm very afraid of death. When the time comes, I'll naturally happily throw myself into the business of writing, and I'll let you happily forget all the interruptions and unhappiness. If there really is a problem, then there's nothing we can do about it. We'll talk about the update later. I wish you all the best. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 794. Yes, after I finished writing the previous chapter, I suddenly realized that after I explained it, I was no longer depressed. I regretted it. I wanted to write, but I didn't want to be scolded again and again. I'm going to write. There will be an update today. I don't know when I can write it. Anyway, there will be an update. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 795. The snowflakes fell on their faces. It was cold, just like how they felt at the beginning. But as they ran, their bodies began to heat up, and the fear in their hearts gradually faded. They looked at the Taoist in indigo on the street and felt that he was just an ordinary person. Their breathing became rapid, their blood began to boil, and they felt fearless. Zhang Nianzu thought to himself, I'll kill you with 1 strike, or 2 strikes if that doesn't work. Li Guangdi thought to himself, I'll stab you to death like a needle. The chopper and the kitchen knife came in front of them. The melon fork was also raised in the air. Then they flew to the sky. Seeing the snowy street getting farther and farther under their feet, and the figure of the Taoist in indigo getting smaller and smaller, the 2 teenagers were terrified and did not know what had happened. The turbulence of the chi of heaven and earth caused by the battle between the Abbey Dean and the Academy remained on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. The seemingly calm wind and snow contained so much power that ordinary people could not even get close. Zhang Nianzu and Li Guangdi wanted to rush over, but the only result was that they would be blown away like 2 rags. The cold wind whistled and brushed past their cheeks. They fell from dozens of feet in the air and fell heavily on the snowy street. With 2 slaps, the snow was splashed and the 2 teenagers spat out blood. Looking at the Taoist in indigo on the street again, the fear in their eyes became more intense. They were in pain all over and did not know if they had broken any bones. They helped each other to stand up and felt each other's bodies tremble. They really cried because it was really painful and they were really afraid. They wanted to wipe their tears, but found that they could not. This made them feel ashamed, so they cried even harder and felt even more ashamed. So they raised their knives and forks, crying and rushing to the street again. No official would pay attention to ants crawling by their shoes, and no driver would pay attention to the praying mantises waving their claws by the state highway. After glancing at the 2 Tang teenagers at first, the Abbey Dean did not pay any more attention to them. He walked calmly on the snowy street, like an immortal or a crane, unstained by the snow and dust. Ning Ke looked at the 2 teenagers who were running for their lives, and his heartbeat inexplicably accelerated. It was as if he saw a praying mantis struggling to block a wheel, or an ant supporting the sole of a giant's shoe. He knew that the 2 teenagers could not change anything, not to mention the fate of Chang and City. Just like how he could not change anything at this moment, including the fate of the 2 teenagers. He was exhausted, helpless, and extremely unwilling to accept everything that had happened in this snowstorm. This kind of unwillingness was like the sharp claws of a ferocious beast tearing at his spirit, making him nervous and in pain. With just a little bit of force, his body began to bleed, but he endured the pain and slowly stood up with trembling legs, because he knew that the 2 youths were about to die. He wanted to watch these 2 youths die. He wanted to stand and watch them die. Zhang Nianzu and Li Guangdi did not die, because they were limping and running at a slow speed. Then something arrived in front of the Abbey Dean. It was a green brick. It was a mottled, mossy, ordinary green brick that had been stuffed in the wall for many years and withstood the wind and rain of Chang'an for many years. The green brick came from an ordinary courtyard beside the Vermilion Bird Avenue. It whistled through the air, flew out of the courtyard wall, and smashed into the Abbey Dean's body. Finally, it fell in front of the Abbey Dean. With a muffled sound, the green brick broke into 4 pieces. Zhang Nianzu and Li Guangdi stopped and looked at the green brick, wondering if the cultivators of the imperial court had finally taken action. Could this green brick be the legendary celestial device? What happened next coldly destroyed the 2 youths' hope for a twist in the story. As the bricks broke, a man with a full beard appeared on the wall. The man was still undressed in the cold winter and was covered in grease. No matter how one looked at him, he did not look like a decent person. Zhang Nianzu knew that this man was a famous ruffian in the Sanyuanli area. He was only good at 5 things in his life, which were cheating and stealing. Although he was not evil, he was definitely not a good person. He admired the men of the Fish Dragon gang and other gangs, but he did not like this ruffian at all. Somehow, when he saw him today, he felt disappointed and warm. It was probably because of the ruffian's appearance that he and Li Guangdi no longer felt as lonely and helpless as before. The ruffian did not dare to get off the wall. He sat on the wall in an ugly posture, holding a dozen bricks in his arms and throwing them at the Abbey Dean in the middle of the street, followed by a series of profanities. "I'll smash you to death. You son of a bitch. You son of a bitch. You son of a bitch. Zhang Mianzu came to his senses and cursed along with the ruffian on the wall. His voice suddenly became hoarse, and he threw the chopper in his hand at the Abbey Dean. Li Guangdi also threw the melon fork in his hand. The green bricks with residual snow marks kept falling from the top of the wall. The two choppers and fork broke through the snow, but none of them could even touch the Abbey Dean's clothes. They all fell to the ground. The Abbey Dean walked on calmly as long as the objects were not close to him and the words were not heard. However, another chopper flew over from the air. A black pot flew over from the other side of the courtyard wall. A bamboo pole for drying clothes fell from upstairs. Boiling hot tea was thrown over together with an expensive teapot. Countless tangs appeared on the courtyard wall and in the tea houses on the street. There was the tea master, the female boss of the tofu stall, urchins, and ruffians. They held the heaviest things in their hands and threw them at the Taoist priest on the street. They cursed the noblest Taoist priest and his parents with the most filthy words. The Vermilion Bird Avenue, which was silent a moment ago, suddenly became noisy. Chang'an, which was like a dead city a moment ago, suddenly became alive. The Tang, who had been hiding a moment ago, had suddenly appeared. They used to be afraid, so they stayed at home silently, waiting for the outcome of the battle between Taoism and the Academy. They were even in fear now, because they were mortals. But when they found out that the Academy was defeated, they suppressed their fear and came to the place where they were needed, just like the two teenagers from Sanyuanli and the ruffian. They wanted to protect the master of the Academy in Chang'an, because the Academy belonged to the Tangs, and the country belonged to the Tangs. As the Tangs, they had to contribute, even if they had to sacrifice their lives. The men in black from the Fish Dragon gang poured out from the street. Dozens of the last Yulin royal guards rode over from the Vermilion Bird Avenue. The cultivators from the Imperial Center administration secretly came from the wind and snow. The old woman led her family to the Vermilion Bird Avenue. An old man with a stick walked behind the crowd. Not far from the old man was a skinny Taoist priest. The skinny Taoist priest led the little Taoist priest in the temple, holding the incense burner used to worship heaven. He looked fierce, like a gangster. Everyone had a ferocious expression on their faces. The kind-looking Tangs, the righteous Tangs, and the pious Tangs all became gangsters at this moment. Chang'an became a city of sin. Because everyone in the city wanted to fight with their lives on the line and kill. It feels good to write it out. It will be 3,000 words tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 796. A little earlier, Ning Ke left the Spring Breeze Pavilion Chow Mansion and walked towards the Vermilion Bird Avenue, leaving behind the worried Xingjing and his wife and old Chow who acted as if nothing had happened. Chow Xiaoshu left Chang, and with Lu Vi and the cavalry of the Valiant Cavalry Battalion. However, the Chow Mansion was still bustling with people. That was because countless government decrees were issued through this mansion to various markets in the city. Moreover, dozens of refugees had been taken in, so the Chow Mansion had not been quiet these days. Today, the Chow Mansion was very quiet. Since early morning, the servants and refugees in the mansion had heard many deafening sounds and the big movements coming from the city. People first heard the ringing of bells throughout the city, followed by the sound of wind and knives, followed by thunder, snow, rain, and explosions until they saw the burning snow clouds in the sky. Fear gradually grew, because no one knew what had happened. When Ning Ke came and left, they knew that the battle did not belong to the human world, so they became more and more confused and cold. There were officials of the imperial court in the Chow Mansion, refugees avoiding the battle, and brave members of the Fish Dragon gang, but they were all ordinary people who were not qualified to join the battle. The courtyard was shrouded in a long period of silence. The refugees held their children nervously, afraid that they would make any noise. Old Chow and Xingjing and his wife sat at the table with different expressions on their faces. Eventually, someone would not be able to bear it. The first person who stood out did not exceed old Chow's expectations. He looked at him and said, "You should know very well that you will die if you go." Mr. Chi replied, Ba, when have you ever seen me afraid of death?" Chen 7, who had been standing quietly by the window, turned around and looked at his fourth brother. He frowned slightly, showing that he did not agree. He was about to say something to stop him, but old Chow waved his hand. "If you want to go, then go. Do you need an old man like me to agree to something like this?" Mr. Chi smiled, turned around and walked out of the Chow mansion with dozens of members of the Tsingyi gang. Chen 7 said after a moment of silence, "There is no point." Old Chow knew what he was talking about. The battle happening on the Vermilion Bird Avenue had already gone beyond the scope of the 5 states and could not be affected by secular forces. The Academy could not defeat the powerful enemy. Even if the Fish Dragon gang or even the entire Chang and were to die, there was no way to stop the enemy. People always need to be helped, or want to be helped. Old Master Chow said, "Although Mr. 13 isn't an ordinary person like us, I think he also hopes that we, the people of Chang'an, can help him." Qin Chi said, "If the help doesn't work, then it's meaningless. Even if the Abbey Dean is really an immortal and only needs to look at us mortals to kill us, who can say that it is completely meaningless as long as he can look at us one more time in the crowd?" The wrinkles on old Master Chow's face were filled with calmness and carefreeness. He said, "Even if it is as you say, that our appearance is meaningless, as long as we appear there, there is meaning." Grand Secretary Xing Jing was the first to understand the meaning of this sentence and nodded in agreement. The Academy is the Academy of the Tang Empire, and the Tang Empire is the Tang Empire of the Academy. The Tang Empire respects the Academy and worships it with all their might. But have you ever seen any Tangs humble themselves to the Academy and treat themselves as servants? They were also protected, but they were completely different from the countries that were bullied by the shrines. Why was it like this? Of course, it was the rules set by the Academy and the headmaster of the Academy. But more importantly, it was the attitude of the Tangs. Old Master Chow said, "We are not the pigs and dogs raised by Taoism in the Yen Kingdom, the South Jin Kingdom, and the Song Kingdom. We are the owners of this land, so we need to appear there, even if we die." Qin Chi was the military counselor of the Fish Dragon gang. He was good at strategizing, but he rarely went to the battlefield. He judged the situation based on the results of his actions. At this moment, when he heard old Master Chow's words, he seemed to be touched. "Since we have to die, of course, the old and the weak should die first. I have lived for more than 70 years, it is time for me to die." Old Master Chow stood up shakily with the help of the table. He took the cane from the bed-warming maid beside him and walked out with the help of an old servant. Grand Secretary Xing Jing said, "I am also old, I should go with Erba." Mrs. Xing said, "I am a useless woman, should go there." Old Master Chow gestured for Qin Chi to bring some people to keep an eye on Xing Jing and his wife. He smiled and said, "If Ning Kai sees that his father-in-law and mother-in-law have been tricked by me to die, I am really afraid that he will give up in anger." There was no spring breeze in the Spring Breeze Pavilion today, only cold snowflakes dancing in the air. The front door of the Chow mansion was wide open. Old Master Chow walked out to the street with the old and weak servants, as well as some elders among the refugees. Old Master Chow held a cane in his hand and knocked on doors as he walked. He called for friends and companions, calling out all the neighbors he was familiar with over the past few decades. "I only want the old ones, not the young ones," Old Master Chow said. He did not look serious, nor did he look sad. Instead, he was smiling, as if he was asking these old guys to drink tea and play chess at the West Lake. The old guys in the neighborhood did not think much of it. The Tangs valued martial arts, and they had all been soldiers in the past. To them, this trip to the Vermilion Bird Avenue was like setting off to the battlefield. This was very common. They even felt that they had returned to the military camp in the past, and they were very excited. After Qin Chi dealt with Xing Jing and his wife, he quickly walked out of the Chow mansion to catch up with old Master Chow. He saw dozens of old men and their nephews, full of fierce aura. Looking at this scene, he revealed a bitter and slightly mocking smile. He thought to himself that such a large crowd was just to let the god take one more look. What a stupid and idiotic behavior. Although he was thinking this, his speed did not slow. Not long after, he had reached the front of the crowd and replaced the old servant to support old Master Chow's body. There was no other way. He was also a Tangs, and sometimes the Tangs were so stupid and idiotic. There was a Taoist temple on a certain street. The person in charge of the affairs of the Taoist temple was a skinny Taoist. The skinny Taoist liked to eat noodles the most. Other than cooking noodles, the thing he did the most in his life was to repair the eaves of his neighbors that had been destroyed by the storm. This was because this was the only work he could do. If he did not want to do this, he would need to save for a long time to buy some good wine and entice his neighbors to come and listen to him preach the teachings of West Hill. This Taoist temple was very inconspicuous, but many things happened here that would be written in history. For example, Yi Su, the world wayfarer of Haotian Taoism, used to be a preacher here, the eldest brother of the academy, and Yi Su once had a debate in front of the stone steps, and Yi Su once comprehended Tao here. He destroyed the Taoist temple and then built a new one. The skinny Taoist was an ordinary Taoist. He only knew the status of Yi Su's Taoist bun, but did not know his real identity. He also did not know that these things had happened in his small Taoist temple. Otherwise, he would not be as troubled as he was now, or he might be even more troubled. I am very troubled. The skinny Taoist looked at the disciples in front of him, and his face was full of worry. He said, I really do not know what to do. Do you have any ideas? The little Taoist recited the scriptures every day. How could they come up with any ideas? The skinny Taoist looked up at the burning snow clouds in the sky and said, I have indeed heard of the Jishou Abbey. That is the unknown place of our Haotian Taoism, and the Abbey Dean is equivalent to our founding master. A little Taoist said, but I heard from the neighbors that the founding master is going to destroy Cheng and city. So I am very troubled. Do you think we should help the founding master or stop him? The skinny Taoist sighed. Suddenly, he stomped his feet heavily as if he was venting his anger, and shouted at the burning snow clouds in the sky, I don't care if he is the founding master or whatever. I have been taking care of this Taoist temple my entire life. Even if Haotian wants to destroy my Taoist temple, I will fight him to the end. The skinny Taoist left the small Taoist temple with the little Taoist priests. They carried the heavy incense burner and the old wood that had been piled up in the corner, ready to fight against their own founding master. Different from the people on the second street of Spring Breeze Pavilion, the struggle in their hearts was even more intense. But once they had made up their minds, they did not hesitate any longer and focused on doing something. This was because they were all people of faith. Being an enemy of Haotian Taoism seemed to be a serious violation of their faith. But whether it was the skinny Taoist or the little Taoist priests, they had long been unclear about what they believed in. They were Tangs who had lived in Cheng and city their entire lives. They used to think that they believed in Haotian, but when they carried the incense burner and the wooden stick out of the Taoist temple, they realized that they believed in faith itself. In short, they were all people of faith. In the teachings of the West Hill Divine Palace, suicide was a serious crime. As a Taoist priest, it was a serious crime to be an enemy of Haotian Taoism. They would definitely receive the cruelest punishment from Haotian. Old Master Chow and his companions appeared on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, which was suicide. The skinny Taoist and the little Taoist priests stood in front of the Abbey Dean, which was apostasy and blasphemy. In other words, they all had sins that could not be washed away. There were many people like them. 3 Taoists from the Southern Gate Temple were setting up a tactical array. They were powerhouses from the Imperial Center administration and the most devout believers of Haotian. Their faces were pale and their hearts were in great pain. But they did not hesitate in their actions. The old lady of Chu, with all the women and children in her residence, stood on the long street. The old lady was the widow of Chu Xiongtu, the general of the 16th Guards. Her silver hair fluttered in the wind and snow. She had 7 sons and 37 grandsons in her life. In the past decades, 2 sons and 3 grandsons had died at the borders of the Tang Empire. This year, in Yanjing, the 7 stockade villages and the Pamir Mountains, another 11 of her grandchildren had died in battle. Now all the men of the Chu residence were fighting with the invaders on the battlefields of the Tang Empire. She only had a dozen old, weak, women and children with her, and only a few knives. She knew that coming here was suicide, but she looked indifferent and did not care. The Chu family was full of loyal warriors. Even if they all died, they would still be loyal warriors. If Haotian had eyes. Then, on this snowy street, everyone was guilty, committing different sins. Today, Chang'an was a city of sin. What a city of sin. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 797. The quietus spread out from the Abbey Dean's eye and was swallowed by Ning Kei's Tao Tai. Through the Array Pestle, it covered the entire city of Chang'an. As a result, the wind and snow became more violent and the coldness was everywhere. The Vermilion Bird Avenue was also very cold. But as more and more Tangs appeared on the wall and on the street, they stood shoulder to shoulder and squeezed on the street, their heels stepping on each other. The temperature on the street gradually rose. The ice and snow melted and even made people feel a little hot. The Tangs' hearts were very hot, so their blood heated up until their bodies were boiling. They clenched their fists and waved their arms to vent their anger. The Vermilion Bird Avenue was filled with shouts and curses. People kept smashing bricks, and some even threw chamber pots, tea, leftovers, and boys' urine at the Abbey Dean. The Tangs believed in Haotian, but strangely, they believed that man could conquer heaven. This was because although the headmaster of the academy had ignored the affairs of the world for many years, his indomitable spirit of fighting against heaven had spread to every town in the Tang Empire through the academy, the royal family, the imperial court, and the army. Therefore, even though they knew that the Taoist in indigo on the street was a powerhouse beyond the imagination of ordinary people and was truly invincible in the world, and in front of this person, ordinary people were as weak as ants. However, the 2 Sanuanli teenagers dared to kill him with knives and forks. Even if the Abbey Dean was a man-eating monster, they still had to give him a try. We can't beat you with so many people, but can't we scold you with so many mouths? Even if this guy was shameless and didn't hurt you, wouldn't you be embarrassed if I poured feces and urine on you? The snow street looked like a holy palace, with a kind of otherworldly beauty. The wind and snow were also clean, without a speck of dust, just like Haotian's face. Now with the attack of the crowd, the long streets suddenly became filthy. Blasphemous shouts and curses, as well as the stench from the human world, drifted into the sky with the wind and snow, smearing Haotian's face in an extremely embarrassing way. The Abbey Dean looked at the filthy breath of the human world drifting into the sky and slightly raised his eyebrows. The feces and urine could not stain his clothes at all, but it made him slightly angry. Within his field of vision, there were at least several thousand Tang on the snowy street. He could also sense that even more Tang were hurrying toward Vermilion Bird Avenue to meet their deaths. The Abbey Dean was slightly surprised to see so many Tangs on the long street, but he did not care. What he cared about was carrying out the will of Haotian and ending the 1,000-year history left by the headmaster in the human world. At this time, Chang'an was full of wind and snow. Hidden in the wind and snow were countless talismans that Ning Kei had written before. Those talismans had successfully filled up many gaps in the god-stunning array. There was only one way. Nothing had changed from the previous situation. The Abbey Dean had to kill Ning Quebec. Ning Kei was on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, and between him and the Abbey Dean was a vast crowd. So the Abbey Dean walked into the crowd. The Abbey Dean's name was Chen Mao. He had the most ordinary name and looked like an ordinary person. When he walked into the crowd, he was like a drop of water that melted into the ocean of people. Then, There was a storm in the ocean, and countless figures were sent flying. It was like the waves hitting the reefs, bringing with them white snow as they dissipated in the dangerous natural environment. Those men in indigo who had rushed over with knives fell in a pool of blood. More than a dozen Yulin royal guards who were charging on horses fell off their horses when they were still dozens of feet away from the Abbey Dean. The Abbey Dean's figure gradually appeared in the ocean of people. Behind him was a mess. Under the pressure of the horrible aura, the crowd gradually parted to make a path. At this time, the cultivators of the Tang Empire finally made their move. The Imperial Center administration had quietly lurked in the surrounding marketplaces. Several array tactical masters started the encircling array. The chi of heaven and earth on the Vermilion Bird Avenue suddenly changed violently. Countless streams of primordial chi turbulence turned into countless primordial chi locks that appeared in the air around the Abbey Dean, blocking all his escape routes. Almost at the same time, more than a dozen military sword masters who were hiding among the ordinary people suddenly made their moves. With a clear clanging sound, bright flying swords broke through the air and pierced toward the Abbey Dean's face. The Abbey Dean's expression did not change at all. He gently brushed his sleeves and continued to move forward. With a flick of his sleeve, the sword will that crisscrossed the long street instantly turned into straw that had been soaked by the rain. It was soft and dispirited, powerless to dissipate. And the countless dangerous Yuan Chi locks, in this moment, were like ripe apples in autumn that had fallen to the ground. They shattered into mud and splashed with juice. The Tang Array tactical masters who were hiding in the market were shocked by the primordial chi and bled to death on the spot. More than a dozen military sword masters, whose natal swords were destroyed by the Abbey Dean, were also seriously injured, and it was unknown whether they were still alive or not. The Abbey Dean continued to move forward, looking for Ning Ke behind the crowd. The crowd was disturbed. The flying bricks stopped for a moment and then continued to fall like a storm. However, even the flying swords of cultivators could not touch the Abbey Dean, let alone the bricks. Even Master Huang Yang's prayer beads could not trap the Abbey Dean for a moment, let alone the dirty water. The Abbey Dean moved forward calmly. Those who stood in his way were crushed to death like ants. The brave Tangs continued to rush toward him and then continued to die. The snow street became a street of blood. Blood sprayed everywhere. Courage was a respectable word in the human world. But in the face of the absolute power that represented Haotian, it seemed so weak and laughable. It was even hard to describe it as heroic. Faced with an insurmountable gap, the people in Cheng and should have been like ants looking up at the blue sky, feeling hopeless and then giving up. But it was hard to imagine that on the faces of the Tangs, one could see sorrow, anger, and unwillingness, but not a trace of despair. They did not despair, they did not cry, and they did not even swear. They just continued to fight in silence. Even if it was a hopeless fight, they would fight to the end. A coolie carrier picked up a shoulder pole and smashed it at the Abbey Dean. Then he died. A peddler from another county picked up a dagger that was used to save his life in the deep mountains. Then he died. A man of unknown identity threw himself at the Abbey Dean. Then he died. People smashed him with bricks, chopped him with kitchen knives, and shot at him with their ancestral bows and arrows. Then they died. They were courting death. Courting death was not a nice word. It seemed a bit stupid. But people were such wonderful creatures. Even though they knew that many things could not be changed, many people still insisted on doing it for one reason or another. People even created a word with a similar meaning. Courting death. The Tangs were courting death today. They were all courting death. They wanted to stop the Abbey Dean. The towering city walls of Cheng and could not stop the enemies. So they built a new city wall with their own flesh and blood. Also, try to write it before 12 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 798. The people on the street, those who stood in front of the Abbey Dean, those who fell in the pool of blood, and all the people who formed the new city wall knew that their deaths would not change anything. But they still did it. Because 1,000 years ago, the headmaster of the academy and their ancestors founded the Tang Empire by the Wei Sisui River. From that day on, they had changed themselves. Ning Ke had said this to the Abbey Dean before. He knew that he could not defend, but he still had to defend. This was his understanding of defense. The Tangs who were dying at this moment seemed to prove his words. However, Ning Ke's heart began to tremble as he looked at the blood-stained street and the people who fell one after another. The remaining frost on his eyelashes made a cracking sound. A clear whistle came from afar. He knew that eldest brother had finally arrived and made a move. This was not the opportunity that the academy had been looking for. The academy's opportunity was with Ning Quebec. However, eldest brother could not wait any longer in the face of the blood-stained street. Just like Ning Ke, he could not bear it any longer. He had been in this world for more than 20 years, but he still believed that he was an atypical Tangs. He had seen too much darkness and always believed in the cold-blooded survival rule. He was willing to pay any price as long as he could live. His heart was as cold as his body that had been frozen by the Abbey Dean's quietus. Most of the ice and snow had fallen off. Ning Ke's body was still cold, but he felt that his body was gradually becoming hot. The blood in his veins began to boil, and he experienced a long-lost feeling. That feeling was called hot blood. He did not like words like tragic or stirring, and the feeling of hot blood was taboo. However, how could the blood from the Abbey Dean's wounds not be hot when he saw so many people dying in front of him? However, hot blood represented hope and desire. Ning Ke longed to live and hoped to defeat the Abbey Dean. Facing the ending of the story where there was no hope, what was the use of hot blood? From time to time, someone ran past him and rushed to the Abbey Dean not far away. He picked up the padao that had fallen from the snow and struggled to support his body. The blade of the padao pierced through the snow and stabbed into the hard bluestone street. Eldest brother was defeated again. Blood gushed out from the holes in his cotton-padded robe. He stood in the south of the Vermilion Bird Avenue, coughing painfully and desolately. He had no idea where Yu Lian had gone. The Abbey Dean kept walking forward. He killed many people, knocked many people away, passed many people, ignored many people, and walked forward step by step, leaving blood behind him. There were casualties everywhere on Vermilion Bird Avenue. The Abbey Dean stopped not far from Ning Quebec. Between the two of them, there were only a few hundred old, weak, women, and children left. The skinny Taoist had lived in Chang'an all his life. He had turned from an ordinary little Taoist into a Taoist now, but he still lived in that small Taoist temple. He had never seen the red-robed priest from the West Hill Divine Palace. A few years ago, when the great divine priest of Revelation was sent to Chang'an, he knelt for a whole night and did not have the chance to listen to the great divine priest's teachings. At this moment, he finally saw the true supreme person of Haotian Taoism. His body trembled uncontrollably. He wanted to kneel in front of the Taoist in indigo and kiss his feet devoutly. He suddenly shouted and took the incense burner from the little Taoist and threw it at the Abbey Dean. The incense burner was used by the small Taoist temple to worship Haotian. It was made of real bronze and very heavy. The skinny Taoist had a heavy heart and was very thin, so he could not throw it far. With a muffled sound, the incense burner hit the skinny Taoist's feet. His feet started to bleed and he cried out in pain. He did not fall down with the help of the little Taoist. Old Lady Chu took the horseman's saber from her third daughter-in-law and stood in front of the Abbey Dean. Old Master Chow walked to the front of the crowd from the back with his walking stick. The Abbey Dean looked calm and his eyes were extremely indifferent. In his eyes, there seemed to be hundreds of millions of stars annihilated, and then there was only emptiness left. It was frightening and awe-inspiring. Under the gaze of this emptiness, everything would end. The Tangs who were ready to die, the unyielding Chang'an, the great Tang Empire, the 1,000-year academy, all the glory and blood, heroic and sinful, bright and dark time, would end here. The long street was cold and bleak. Looking at the Abbey Dean's ordinary face and eyes, Ning Ke suddenly thought of the great people he had met or felt in his life. Whether it was the headmaster, youngest uncle, or Lotus, they were all people who were truly enlightened, freed themselves, and understood what they really wanted. That was why they were unimaginably powerful. The Abbey Dean was also such a person. Today, the academy was defeated by the Abbey Dean. It was a matter of course. The academy believed that it was a matter of course, so it should be as calm and composed as those who died on the long street. But he could not do that. Because he was not reconciled to it. The Xiangwan Plain was a pasture with excellent water and grass in the north of the Tang Empire. Now, this pasture had become the most tragic battlefield. The cavalry of the Golden Tribe Royal Court and the elite cavalry of the Northern Battlefront Army had been fighting for a key riding path at the edge of the pasture for 3 days and 3 nights. The cavalry of the Golden Tribe, who had the advantage in numbers, had finally suppressed the Tang army to several hills in the north of the riding path after paying a heavy price. They were launching the final attack. The war horses collided with each other, producing a dull and terrifying sound. The friction between curved blades and straight blades produced an ear-piercing sound. The sounds of killing and war drums, however, were much quieter, because both sides were exhausted to the extreme. The battle on horseback had turned into a battle on foot. The last 1,000 Tang soldiers used their last strength and life to resist the attack of the cavalry of the Golden Tribe. But they were about to collapse. A Tang military officer and a dozen of his subordinates were surrounded by the warriors of the Golden Tribe. The officer was a little short and not as strong as the ordinary Tang soldiers. But at such a critical moment, he burst out with unimaginable combat power and cut down 3 enemies in a row. Several curved blades broke through the air. The short officer raised his blade and was forced to kneel on one knee, struggling to support himself. He heard cries of pain coming from around the hills. Through the fluttering hair in front of his eyes, he saw many of his companions fall and those barbarians cruelly stabbing the bodies of their companions. Could they really not hold on any longer? He thought. Could they really not hold on until the main force of cavalry came back? No despair could be seen on his pale and delicate face. He did not think that he should be desperate. Because he was not reconciled. A troop was running wildly in the wilderness of the eastern border. They were the cavalry of the valiant cavalry battalion. They had left Chang'an to fight in the eastern border. At this time, they were in a hurry to return to Chang'an. The cavalry and their mounts were already exhausted, but no one asked for a rest. Because they had finally confirmed the whereabouts of Prince Long Qing and the 2,000 grassland elite cavalry. Long Qing was marching towards Chang'an. This meant that the coalition against the Tang Empire was sure that Chang'an could be broken through. Chao Xiaoshu's face was as thin as a hard stone that had been cut open, dark and haggard. The cold wind blew on his face. It was many days late. He and his cavalry had just gone after them. They should not be able to catch up. Even if they caught up, what could they do? But he still asked his subordinates to continue running towards Chang'an. Because he was not reconciled. These 2 chapters don't have a lot of words, but I really can't help it. Recently, I've been writing as hard as I can. Tomorrow is Saturday, and I'll have 1 chapter on Sunday. Then, I'll start writing 2 chapters on Monday. Yes, I swear on my father's character that even if I'm not good at other things, everyone should still be able to recognize my seriousness towards my work. So, please rest assured in this aspect, I'll definitely write well. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 799. The flames danced wildly on the silver mask and in the black eyes, like lightning in the summer rain. It was winter and snowflakes were falling. It was not Chang'an where the chi of heaven and earth was restless, so there was no lightning. It was real flames. The snow-covered fields and the beautiful and quiet village by the state highway should have been a beautiful picture. But after being burned by the fierce flames, it suddenly became a black and desolate wasteland. Prince Longqing looked at the scene in front of him quietly with an indifferent expression. There was no excitement on his face. Only his hand that was tightly holding the reins revealed some of his real emotions at this time. After leading the Eastern Wilderness Cavalry into the Tang territory, he only ordered his subordinates to set 2 fires. One was in the distant eastern border, and the other was in the village at this time. He led 2,000 of his most elite cavalry subordinates to attack Chang'an at all costs. Neither the Tang Volunteer Army nor the troublesome Valiant Cavalry Battalion could catch up with him. They were very close to Chang'an. When he lost to Ning Kai in the Academy's mountain climbing examination, he left Chang'an with the West Hill Divine Palace's diplomatic corps and the papal cavalrymen. On the state highway, he recalled the scenes he had seen and the feelings he had back then. Then he thought of the great ambition he had once made. I want to pull down all these ugly Tang houses and eradicate all the rape flowers in the fields. Then I will burn them all. I will burn away all the evil and filth, so that there will only be light left in this world. He was about to return to Chang'an, which had left him with endless humiliation and pain. In a sense, it had changed his life. His cultivation state and strength were far better than before, but his eyes were no longer pure and bright. In the fields beside the road, the rape flowers have not yet grown. The houses painted by the farmers of the Tang Empire are still as beautiful or ugly as they were in the past. Then, let's burn them all down. And tell the people in Chang'an that he was coming. It was snowing in Chang'an, and it was raining in the north of Shao Mountain. But it was equally cold. The rain soaked through the armor and coat, seeped into the clothes, and went straight to the body. It was more unbearable. In the cold rain, the entire southern battlefront army was marching northward. Figures of the Tang army were everywhere in the forest of Shao Mountain. They were so dense that they looked like leaves that had fallen in the forest for thousands of years. The march was very difficult. The cold weather and rain, the rotting leaves, and the trampled mountain paths were all their enemies. Many people had already fallen behind along the way. Even more people continued to move forward. Even if their faces were pale and their bodies and minds were exhausted, they still gritted their teeth and lowered their heads, following the people in front of them as they crawled through the muddy wilderness. Only by clenching their teeth could they continue to persevere. Only by remaining silent could they conserve their last bit of strength. Only by lowering their heads could the exhausted people clearly see the direction of the march. More than 100,000 soldiers of the Tang army walked in the mountains and fields without making much noise. Only the sound of military boots stepping on the mud and the occasional sound of heavy objects falling could be heard. This kind of silence made one's heart palpitate, and it was what made their enemies most afraid of them. From the generals to the ordinary soldiers of the Tang army, they firmly believed that even if the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army really had millions of troops, as long as they could arrive, they would definitely be able to stop the enemy. They had to rush to the north of the Verdant Canyon. The West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army did not give them much time. They had no time to sleep or eat hot meals. All their time was spent on the road. They walked in the day, in the night, in the snow, in the rain, and in the miasma in the dense forest. They kept walking on the road. However, the road was too long after all. The Southern Battlefront Army had tried their best, but they were still some distance from the north of the Verdant Canyon. It had been a few days since the arrival date set by the military ministry. Logically speaking, the Verdant Canyon should have been lost. There was no point for the Southern Battlefront Army to rush there, and it would be dangerous. What they should do now was to find out the enemy's situation and then retreat to wait for reinforcements. But the Southern Battlefront Army was still rushing because they had not received a new military order. Their task was still to rush to the Verdant Canyon and defend where they were because they almost blindly believed in the ability of the Academy. Because they were not reconciled. On the other side of the Shao Mountain, the clouds were thin and the rain was light. The rain pattered on the calm field and was instantly absorbed by the soil. It was impossible to wash away the blood accumulated in the past 7 days, but it only made it a little wet. The ground in front of the verdant canyon was relatively hard because it had been crushed by the chi of heaven and earth of 3 peerless powerhouses in a row. The rain seeped slowly and accumulated in the messy hoof prints. There was a rumble in the distance in the south of the field. The earth began to shake and the shallow water in the hoof prints began to sway. The catapult from the South Jin Kingdom has finally arrived. The 6th brother looked at the things that appeared in the distance and felt the vibration coming from under his feet. His body, which looked like it was cast from iron, was covered with countless bloodstains. Even the hammer had deep marks on it. The 4th brother sat under the iron canopy, holding the river and mountain sandbox and struggling to fight against the virtual sword left by the Abbey Dean a few days ago. Except for him, the other disciples of the academy had been seriously injured. There was a flower in Wang Qi's hair, which had been dyed black with blood. The front of Shiman Buhua's robe was stained with blood and his face was as pale as paper. Beigong Weiyang's hands fell on the blood-stained zither, twitching like a bird's claws. Jun Mo had changed into a new set of clothes. It was plain and bloodless, and his left sleeve was fluttering in the cold wind. His head was lowered, and he looked very tired. He looked at the water in the hoof prints in front of him and remained silent. There were broken limbs and corpses everywhere in front of the verdant canyon. Only around him was relatively empty. After Lu Bai retreated, there was a series of battles in front of the verdant canyon. Every time the Divine Hall Coalition army was about to devour the academy disciples, there would always be sword light and zither music in the pool of blood. Yi Hongyu stood in the distance and her divine robe of judgment was stained with blood. 7 days later, she finally saw the dawn of victory. After all, the academy was not Haotian and could not be omnipotent. Jun Mo slowly bowed and picked up the high crown that had fallen on the ground. Since he lost the crown in the battle with Lu Bai, he had not paid attention to it because he had no time. The crown was stained with blood and ashes. He slowly frowned and wanted to brush off the blood and ashes. But he had lost his left hand and was holding the crown in his right hand. Muyu walked to his side and took the crown. She carefully wiped it with the embroidered handkerchief in her hand. Jun Mo leaned forward as if he was bowing to her. Muyu's eyes were slightly wet and she smiled back. This was bowing to him. Muyu said, "I agree to marry you." Jun Mo said calmly, "That's good." Muyu put the crown on his head and carefully straightened it. This was a proper crown. Jun Mo said, "A proper crown is a proper death." Muyu said, "It's reasonable to die together." Cries rang out in front of the verdant canyon. Beigong Weiyang broke the zither strings and blood splashed everywhere. He cried out, "I can't accept it. I'll start writing 2 chapters tomorrow. There'll be 2 chapters of 3,000 words. Please supervise me and vote for me. I'll try my best to write them. I won't let you vote unwillingly. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 800. Ning Ke lowered his head and stood on the snowy street. Blood kept flowing out of the holes in his fingers. The frozen blood clots were washed away by fresh blood from time to time. He looked miserable. He held the array pestle in one hand and the hilt in the other. But he could not write a talisman or wield his blade. If it were not for the pedal supporting his body, he might fall down again at any time. He did not look at the Abbey Dean's eyes, because he might die if he made eye contact with the Abbey Dean. He could only look at the Abbey Dean's feet, and his eyes were as low as the dust under the snow. He was covered in blood. Except for his own, most of it was the blood of the ordinary people who had died in the hands of the Abbey Dean. He felt that the fresh blood was hotter than his own. Stimulated by the blood of the ordinary people, his blood had already heated up. But what made him sad was that his body was cold, and so was his heart. No matter how unwilling he was frozen by the coldness of quietus. He could not find any strength, only fatigue and helplessness. Countless talismans of E were still floating in the streets and alleys of Chang'an, hidden in the wind and snow. They did not disperse with the help of the god-stunning array. This was Ning Kei's most powerful skill. But it had been proven that it could not defeat the Abbey Dean. He looked at the Abbey Dean's feet, as if he saw the corpses of ants under the soles of the Abbey Dean's shoes. These ants were the bravest and most fearless, but now they were all dead. Even amazing courage could not change the gap between heaven and man. Then what else could the people in the human world do except to surrender to Haotian? What was the point of being unwilling? The Abbey Dean had been cultivating Haotian's ruthlessness all his life. Besides, he was good at foresight and forbearance. Those who could forbear, and those who could forbear, did not have any unbearable heart. Although the Tangs who fought to be the first to die on the snowy street did not change the outcome of the battle, the incredible scenes still surprised him. Not because he could not bear it, but because he was puzzled. The Abbey Dean had seen many people who could face the final end calmly, but all of them were grand cultivators who had transcended the mortal world. There were very few ordinary people. In the city of Chang'an, there were so many ordinary people who could face death calmly, which was beyond his expectation. In other words, it was beyond his evaluation of ordinary people. Maybe the Tangs are really special. The Abbey Dean looked at the old people and the weak people in front of him with his hands behind his back. Looking at their fearless faces in the wind and snow, he suddenly asked, "Are you willing to die like ants?" It was old Chow who answered him. Old Master Chow leaned on his walking stick and walked shakily to the front of the crowd. He said, "Being willing is sweet, being willing is comfortable. How can you let yourself feel comfortable? I don't know what the people outside will say, but for us old Shang and people, as long as we don't feel ashamed when we die, we will feel comfortable. Old to die to die." The Abbey Dean looked at old Master Chow and said, "You are extraordinary. How should I address you?" The Abbey Dean looked at old Chow and said, "Old." The Abbey to the Dean. "There is nothing special about me. We are just ordinary people. But no matter if we are the most ordinary people or the most extraordinary people like you, we are all human. As long as we are human, we all have to die." The meaning of old Chow's words was clear. No matter if you were the Abbey Dean of the Jishou Abbey or a follower of Haotian, you would become a pile of dirt or ashes after death. Then we were equal. That is why so many people are fighting to die. The Abbey Dean looked at the Tang corpses on the Vermilion Bird Avenue and said thoughtfully, "The Tangs have a tradition of dying." Old Master Chow's expression gradually became solemn and he said, "In the first battle with the various countries, when the wind and rain were precarious, none of the Tangs surrendered. In the battle with the desolate, none of the Tangs surrendered. Since the founding of the Tang Empire by the Sisui River, it has been more than 1,000 years since the founding of the Tang Empire. Back then, Emperor Taizu risked his country's destruction and exhausted the nation's power to send his army to the northern wilderness. He did not return until all the enemies were killed. The academy dared to compete with Buddhism and Taoism for a lonely young girl. Mr. Second only vented his anger when he destroyed the stone statue of Buddha Ku. The Tang is strong because it dares to hate. The Tang Empire is strong because of the Tangs." Old Master Chow looked at the Abbey Dean and said in a hoarse voice, "Since the ancient times, there have been people who worked hard in the Tang Empire. There were people who worked hard. There were people who stood up in the face of injustice and bullying. There were people who died in the face of invasion. The Southern Army marched towards the verdant canyon in the forest of the Shao Mountain. The cold rain seeped into their collars, taking away the warmth and bringing the sick. Soldiers fell off the cliff from time to time. Their companions stood silently at the edge of the cliff for a while before continuing forward. They tiredly lowered their heads. Even though they knew it was already too late, they still refused to stop running. Risking their lives, they ran unreasonably, desperately rushing their way. Yang Erxi killed a barbarian from the eastern wilderness. He treasured the machete he got from the battlefield. He sheathed the machete and took the pitchfork from his shoulder. Then he smashed the barbarian to make sure he was dead. The sounds of fighting in the field gradually subsided. He wiped the sweat off his forehead and panted heavily as he looked around. Then, he saw a few familiar companions lying on the snow-covered winter fields. After the battle, he stood in front of the shallow mounds and kept silent for a long time. Then he looked in the direction of his hometown. He missed his wife's braised pig's trotters. The wall of the school in his hometown had not been finished. Back then, because he felt that the salary given by the yamen was not fair, he refused to take the job. He quarreled with the village chief and almost flipped the table. He was even ready to go to the county government to file a lawsuit. It was not until he could not stand his daughter's anger and his wife's grumbling that he reluctantly took the job. But he saw the notice halfway through. He carried the pitchfork and meat and wine and left his hometown for the distant eastern border. He did not know when the wall of the school would be finished. He did not know if he had the chance to finish it. At least it was in his hands. Young Urxi looked in the direction of his hometown and thought of these troublesome things. He furrowed his brows in annoyance, and the newly added scar split open again. Blood flowed down. He raised his arm and wiped it with his sleeve. He suddenly thought of the teacher in the school. Now he would not be angry because of the unfinished wall. So he laughed happily. The battle on the Xiangwan plain was still fierce. The short officer was forced to kneel on one knee by the barbarians' machetes. He was in a very dangerous situation. He was struggling to hold on. A black shadow flew up from the side and heavily smashed into the bodies of those barbarians. The bright machete slashed across the meadow that seemed to be burning. The black shadow fell to the ground with 2 cuts on his chest. Blood was dripping and it seemed that he would not survive. The officer recognized that it was his close attendant. He shouted in grief and indignation. The pedao in his hand left his head and slashed toward the opposite side. At this moment, he did not even think that the machete above his head would cut him in half. He was very lucky. The barbarians who besieged him were killed by him, but he did not die. He had been cut in the shoulder, and the blood flowed like the milk wine in a cut wineskin. The most dangerous thing was that his helmet was knocked off by the enemy's machete. The enemy's blade, after knocking off his helmet, also cut open his hair bun. Her black hair was draped over her shoulders, and her delicate face was not covered by her armor. At this moment, everyone could see that this officer was actually a woman. She was Situilan. She carried the heavy pedao, with wounds and anger all over her body. She led the last of her subordinates and started to fight again. She did not know how long she would fight, but she knew that she would fight until death or victory. There is a saying in Chang, and that can entrust a lonely person 6 feet away. Old Master Chow looked at the Abbey Dean and continued. At this time, the distant imperial palace was shrouded in wind and snow. Tang Xiaotang stood in the snow in front of the palace, quietly looking at the south. The empress held the little emperor's hand and stood behind the sill, looking at the increasingly heavy snow outside the palace. A cough came from the other end of the street. Eldest brother came out. His cotton-padded jacket had long been torn. Cotton peeked out from inside, white as snow, and some places were dyed red, red like blood. Fresh and bright, very moving. Ning Kei stood at the other end of the street, also covered in blood. He held the array pestle, the blood coagulating the pestle and the palm of his hand. This pestle, this array, and this city were entrusted to him by his teachers and his majesty. Then he would not let it go until he died. Old Master Chow's hand holding the crutch trembled slightly, and his voice suddenly became excited. I can entrust my life 100 miles away, in front of the verdant canyon. Jun Mo had straightened his clothes and hat. He held the iron sword in one hand and looked at the enemy cavalry in the wilderness. He was expressionless and began to burn the last of his psyche power. As if the whole world could feel the heat brought by his burning life, the rain suddenly stopped, and the rain clouds above the wilderness gradually dissipated, revealing a line of blue sky. Sunlight shone through the gaps in the clouds and fell on him. On the academy's fellow disciples. Old Master Chow looked at the street full of Tang corpses and suddenly burst into tears. Then he laughed and shouted to the Abbey Dean. "I can't take away the important thing, a gentleman." The old voice echoed in the Vermilion Bird Avenue, in the wind and snow, on the Winter Willow and Snow Lake, in front of the Verdant Canyon, in the Shao Mountain, in the eastern border, in the northern border, and in every inch of the Tang Empire. I can entrust my life 100 miles away. I can entrust my life 100 miles away. I can't take away the important thing, a gentleman. The Tang Empire has never lacked such people. The Tang Empire is a country of gentlemen. Old Master Chow stared into the Abbey Dean's eyes and said sternly, "Such a beautiful country is going to be destroyed by you evil old Taoists. You still ask me if I'm willing." He raised his crutch and was about to smash it. "I'm willing, your grandmother." This chapter took a lot of effort and a long time to write. The next chapter may be a little later. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 801. The impassioned and powerful declaration suddenly turned into dirty words with a double meaning. He shouted at the old master that he wanted to kill the Abbey Dean and smashed her with his staff. Ordinary people and extraordinary people were all human beings. They would turn into dust after death. But there was a big difference between them when they were alive. The old man's crutch could not beat the Abbey Dean. The people on the snow street all thought that old Master Chow was dead. But in fact, he was not. The Abbey Dean did nothing and just walked past him calmly. The eldest brother vaguely guessed the Abbey Dean's intention. Taoism wanted to destroy Chang'an City and also the hearts of the people in Chang'an. The Abbey Dean's massacre on the long street was to use the most powerful means to smash the hardest shell of the Tangs and trample their pride into the mud. Since killing could not solve the problem, then he chose to ignore it. But the Abbey Dean did not know the Tangs very well. Old Chow had walked on the edge of life and death, but he did not become confused, suspicious or even afraid because of the Abbey Dean's ignorance. If he did not hit him, he would have another chance in the future. If he did not die, he did not die. Being alive was better than being dead. There was no need for self-doubt. Old Chow leaned on his crutch and walked to the side of the street, cursing. His words were dirty, even dirtier than the dirty things in the snow. The Abbey Dean raised his eyebrows slightly and continued to walk toward Ning, Quebec. They would soon reach the Imperial Palace. Eldest brother said, "This is not right." The Abbey Dean said, "Although the Tang Empire is strong, it is doomed. What can you do?" In front of the Verdant Canyon. Yi Hongyu looked at June Mo. Blood flowed down her sleeves and onto the ground, mixing with the blood stains that had accumulated over the past few days. She was very calm because she knew that June Mo was much more seriously injured than she was. He was burning the last of his psyche power and even his life, even though he was facing death. Looking at June Mo's expressionless face and the blood-soaked disciples of the academy behind him, she recalled the thrilling battles in front of the Verdant Canyon in the past 7 days. She thought about how these few people had blocked the mighty Divine Hall Coalition army in the south of the Tang Empire and prevented them from advancing north. Someone like June Mo, fighting bitterly and on the verge of death, even she couldn't help but be somewhat moved. The deepest part of her eyes was filled with the brilliance of the divine stars, as well as a bit of pity and admiration. What can you do if the heavens want to destroy your academy? She looked at June Mo. June Mo looked up at the sky. At this time, the rain had stopped, but the clouds had not completely dispersed. Only a few spots of the clear sky could be seen, like broken porcelain. Furthermore, even if the rain and clouds dispersed and the sky was completely clear, there was no way for him to see that bright moon. Before he died in battle, he only took a glance at his teacher. He did not directly answer Yi Hongyu's question. Instead, he said, "Chao Shaoshu is a very good person. If nothing had happened back then, he would have been my younger brother." Yi Hongyu knew who Cao Xiaoshu was, but she did not understand why Jun Mo would mention him at this time. Jun Mo looked at the sky, searching for the traces left by the bright moon on the previous 7 nights. He continued, it's just that he liked to follow the former emperor, so he didn't enter the academy. Back then, the former emperor was determined to clean up the imperial court, so there was that night at Spring Breeze Pavilion. Yi Hongyu knew the famous night at Spring Breeze Pavilion. The names of Cao Xiaoshu and Ning Ke were only noticed by the West Hill Divine Palace after that rainy night. Jun Mo withdrew his gaze and looked at her. He said, before that night, Cao Xiaoshu negotiated with the other party at the House of Red Sleeves. He said 2 sentences, which were widely spread in Cheng, and after that. At that time, he said these 2 sentences. Jun Mo said, if the heavens can tolerate me, I can live. If not, I will kill. Yi Hongyu suddenly felt a little cold, because she knew what she was going to hear next. Although the whole world was against the Tang Empire, and Haotian Taoism and the Tang Empire were irreconcilable, she still did not expect that in the world of Haotian, someone would raise this question so calmly and firmly. As expected, Jun Mo lightly shook his right arm, and the wide and square iron sword splashed down a stream of blood. He held the iron sword and looked at Yi Hongyu, as if he was looking at the sky above her head. He said, I have always thought these 2 sentences were not appropriate, because even if the heavens cannot tolerate me, I still want to live. If the evil heavens really cannot tolerate me, then I cannot allow it to live either. He finally said, at least I cannot let it live too happily. On the snowy street in Chang'an, eldest brother looked at the Abbey Dean and said, the headmaster once said that the heavens will obey the will of the people. If the heavens do not obey, if the heavens cannot tolerate, then what will you do? The Abbey Dean stopped and looked at the falling snow. After a pause, he said thoughtfully, you can look up and see if the heavens have ever spared anyone. It was quiet. No one spoke, because no one could answer the Abbey Dean's question. In the face of absolute power, courage was admirable, but there was no power. In the cold eyes of the heavens, humans' will was never important. The skinny Taoist was silent. The old lady of Chu was silent. The injured were silent. The dead could not speak. Even Chao Erbai's lips moved for a while, but no words came out. Finally, a voice broke the silence of the world. The voice was very hoarse and dry. It was probably because he had not drunk water for a long time, and he had lost too much blood in his body. It sounded a little harsh to the ears. The voice sounded very tired, and even a little weak. But it was very determined. The so-called harsh sound was not like the sound of a sharp object rubbing against a mirror, but the sound of a mirror breaking. The voice said, then destroy it. The Abbey Dean looked at the back of the crowd and saw Ning Ke's bloody face. Then he saw Ning Ke's eyes. Their eyes met for the first time in a long time. Ning Ke looked at him and said, the heavens will obey the will of the people. If the heavens do not obey, then destroy it. I think this is a very simple truth. The Abbey Dean looked at the determination and confidence in his eyes and slowly raised his eyebrows. The natural stream magical finger had seriously injured Ning Ke and destroyed his confidence. But at that time, his spiritual world was still firm. Later, he gradually became a little absent-minded. He looked at the 2 youths crying and doing the most unimaginable thing in the world. So he decided to stand up. He really stood up. But he could only rely on the Pidao to support his weak body. Then, countless ordinary people ran past him and ran towards the black sea of death. He saw many people die in front of him. He felt that it was wrong. The choices of these ordinary people completely went against his understanding of this world and his rules. Although he had seen many similar scenes on the battlefield, the scene he saw today still brought him an unbearable mental shock. Because in the past, he had always put himself out of the picture. Today, he was on this street, in the picture. His body and soul, along with the blood, as the bodies fell, and the souls scattered, finally landed on this world. In the past, He was willing to die for Chang and because of his responsibility and affection. He insisted that it was not because he was hot-blooded because of his responsibility and affection for the academy, the headmaster, his master Yen Sei, and his majesty. He thought that his blood was cold. When the blood in his body began to heat up and even boil, he began to be confused and his mental state became a little absent-minded. He vaguely felt a kind of power. He had seen that kind of power more than once. But there had never been a time when he felt it more vividly than at this moment on the snowy street. At this moment, an old voice began to ring in his ears and heart. He did not know that it was Uncle Chow who was talking. The old voice echoed throughout the Tang Empire. His consciousness seemed to float to the great rivers and mountains. He saw all kinds of people everywhere. Those people were fighting, marching, risking their lives, persevering, or just waiting. But that kind of waiting was also full of a kind of impressive tenacity. He saw many people, and they were all extraordinary people. Following that, many more scenes flashed past his eyes. He saw the blood-stained hatchet in the woodshed, the cracked fields of Hebei County, the starving people like ghosts, the vast Min Mountain, the old hunters, the soil of the city of Wei, the lanterns of Cheng, and at night, the lake in the wilderness, and the moss-covered tomb in the Lank Temple. He saw many people. Perhaps they were not extraordinary, but they were all people. He seemed to have returned to the stone statue of the Lank Temple and meditated. He seemed to have had his last conversation with Lotus in the White Bone Mountain at the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. He seemed to have seen the Talisman Master in the primitive tribe when he entered Talisman Taoism that summer. The earliest humans fought with wild beasts in the wilderness. They began to wear animal skins, eat meat, and live in caves. Then they began to farm, raise livestock, and eat more meat. They continued to eat meat and thought of many ways to cook meat to ensure that the meat was delicious. They could eat more meat because eating meat could make them stronger. He saw humans building houses, villages, and roads. Finally, he saw a magnificent city standing on the plains, as if it was going to pierce through the sky. That was Chang'an. He walked in Chang'an and saw the bun shop he had seen a few days ago. He remembered the aura that day, the power that only belonged to the human world. This power could change the world. This power could defeat time. This power was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary. It was the most dazzling and the most inconspicuous. It was the hot fog in the bun shop or a brick in the city wall. But it was also the inheritance of wisdom and unyielding resistance. Ning Ke suddenly felt very touched. This power was so great. But he was so close to it, and he could feel it so clearly. He felt his own insignificance, but it was not like when he faced Haoyan. He would not be angry because of his own insignificance, but only respect and yearn because of his own insignificance. Because no matter how insignificant he was still a part of this power. No matter how great this power was, it came from countless insignificant people like him. I will write 2 more chapters tomorrow. I will try my best. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 802. This was the power of the human world. It was not the first time that Ning Ke had sensed its existence. In the wilderness, the headmaster had summoned the ancient sword from the sword garret thousands of miles away to kill the golden dragon. He had used this power. In the houses across the Yanming Lake, he had also sensed this power. What he did not understand was how to use this power for himself. He had asked the headmaster of the academy about this. The headmaster of the academy said that he was the human world and his power was the power of the human world. The answer was simple and meaningless to him. He looked at the bright moon in the night sky and thought of the headmaster. He looked at the pine tree by the cliff and thought of the youngest uncle. He looked at the bloody front yard of the Lank Temple and thought of Lotus. He thought of the last conversation with the headmaster by the Sisui River. It turned out that Lotus was right. The youngest uncle was proud and free. He wanted to represent the human world and pierce through the sky as a powerhouse. The headmaster of the academy thought that he was the human world and he wanted to lead the human world to challenge Haoyan. However, the human world was where people lived. The power of the human world came from everyone who lived there. This power could not be represented and did not need to be led. It could only be exerted when everyone was together. The headmaster of the academy built the Tang Empire and was actually on the right path. However, the headmaster of the academy still wanted to lead everyone to do this through education and guidance. Because of his obsession, the state that Lotus had reached was still some distance away from the headmaster of the academy and the youngest uncle. However, it was also because of his obsession that he thought more extreme. In the night rain, he looked at his wife's grave and wanted to dig it up. However, he gave up and floated away. From that moment on, Lotus had gone crazy. After that, whether it was the destruction of the Devil's Doctrine or the massacre of Lank, it was all because he had gone crazy. He wanted to destroy the world. In his eyes, life and death had no meaning, including himself. He had been pursuing the devil to cover the sky and obey the heaven with Taoism. Finally, he reached the Nirvana realm with Buddhism and jumped out of the three realms. He wanted to erase the ruthless heaven's way of the old world in a brand new world and find something that he wanted to find through time. In other words, he wanted to break the most fundamental rule of the world. He wanted to destroy Haoyan. And the method he chose was to make the entire human world go crazy with him, or even destroy it. This method was bloody and cruel, but it was correct. If Haoyan knew that there was such a person who came up with such a crazy idea just because he wanted to resurrect his wife in the tomb, he would probably tremble. Ning Ke had wandered around the world with Sang Sang when he was a child, so he did not have much patience. Therefore, whenever Sang Sang could do something, he would teach her one thing. Do your own things. Therefore, the affairs of the human world should be done by people, and everyone should do it together. Ning Ke opened his eyes and found himself still standing on the snowy street. He did not know if he had already woken up or if he was still in a dream. He looked at the injured people on the street who were clenching their teeth and refusing to let out a scream. He looked at the corpses of the ordinary people. He looked at the two heavily injured but stubborn teenagers. He understood many things. Chang'an was not a city. It was people. It was everyone who lived in the city. The power of the human world came from everyone who lived here. Several people, dozens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people. Everyone's wishes and desires were a kind of power. The desire of millions of people was the power of the human world. This power was so powerful that it could change the appearance of heaven and earth, and it could resist the passage of time. This power was like a bloody wave when it came to Lotus. This power was like the mark left by the sword when it came to youngest uncle. This power was like the desire of the headmaster to break the sky. But that wasn't even the full extent of this power. Lotus could not get the recognition of this power, or he did not have the opportunity to mobilize this power. Youngest uncle was heroic and unparalleled, so he was lonely. The headmaster could be called the teacher of all ages, but he forgot that the ink scroll should always be written by the students themselves. Master Yen Sei spent his whole life looking for that word. That word represented the power of the human world. But as the Abbey Dean once said, that word was too heavy. How could the will of millions not be heavy? And how could the will of millions be the same? Therefore, no one could write that word. Even the headmaster could not write it. At this time, Ning Ke finally saw that word clearly. He saw many people on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. Thousands of ordinary people came together for the same purpose. They built a new city wall with their flesh and blood. The will of the people really became a city at this time. The will and desire of the tens of millions of people here were strong and united. This was a part of the human world. For Chang'an City, this was the most desperate and angry moment. But it was the best moment to write that word. The question Ning Ke needed to think about now was how to write that word. Seeing that word did not mean that he could write it. Just like when he first came to the old library and looked at the shelves full of precious classics, he looked at those words that he had seen countless times, but he could not even remember them, not to mention write them. He thought of the 3 months on the sea and the conversation with the headmaster. The headmaster said that Haotian was not the world itself, but the collection of the most fundamental rules of the world. The headmaster said that when the rules controlled the world was stable and boring. Only when the new power appeared and broke the old rules, the world could be lively and interesting again. The headmaster said that human was the greatest product of the world, because human had wisdom and could inherit. Human had the instinct to fight against and even break the fundamental rules of the world. That kind of will was so stubborn and powerful that it could be called desire. Therefore, the human world and Haotian would inevitably go against each other until there was a winner. In the past history of the world, Haotian won countless times, and the human world ushered in countless long nights. The inherited wisdom withered in the cold eternal night. But the human world would always revive and challenge again. It was daytime now, so the sky was naturally white. The snowflakes falling from the sky were also white. The vermilion bird avenue in the wind and snow was pure white. The accumulated blood on the street gradually turned black. The tangs lying in the pool of blood were all wearing dark clothes. The bricks, iron pots, and chamber pots scattered on the street were all dirty and black. Since Haotian chose white, the human world chose black. The world became black and white in Ning Kei's eyes. Light and darkness, holiness and filth. The black and white world became an extremely simple picture in his eyes. It became two absolutely parallel lines, looking at each other coldly and unwilling to get close. The two lines were shortened, and then they had a length. Ning Kei was very familiar with this picture. It was the first divine talisman he learned, the two horizontal talisman. Then, one of the lines suddenly deflected and stabbed into the other line. This was the second divine talisman he learned last night by the lake, the E-talisman. When the two lines touched, the two worlds were connected, but they could not merge and began to have a fierce conflict. A piercingly cold cutting intent, as if it wanted to cut open the entire space. Different from Master Yen Sei's Jing Fu, which had its own rules and its own calm area, the E-fu spread around endlessly, just like weeds growing fiercely. The E-talisman was very powerful. Besides cutting, the two worlds could be connected. It had a kind of endless meaning, representing the balance between the human world and Haotian. But this was not what Ning Kei wanted, nor was it what Chang An needed now. Looking at the E-talisman on the snowy street, he seemed to see countless weeds, or 2 dry sticks of firewood, or even a chopper stuck in the fertile plains. The 2 firewood could not be put together firmly, and one of the firewood slowly collapsed. A hand grasped the handle, trying to pull the chopper out of the field. Suddenly, a stone with moss appeared in the weeds. It was the stone at the bottom of the Daming Lake in front of the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. When youngest uncle broke the stone array tactics, he cut 2 sword marks on each stone. 2 sword marks, 1 word. Ning Kei really woke up. He was familiar with this situation. He had similar experiences when he saw the sword marks left by youngest uncle at the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, and when he faced the stone statue of the Venerable in the Lank Temple. Today, he meditated on the snowy street for a short time, but he gained a lot. Even if some of them could not be used by him now, they would become the most precious treasures on his cultivation path as long as he could survive. He knew something had happened. Then he heard Uncle Chow say, F***CKU. Then he heard the Abbey Dean ask eldest brother, has heaven ever spared anyone? He had heard this sentence before. At the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, Lotus had asked him the same question. At that time, his answer was, man can conquer heaven, and there is no need for heaven to spare him. But today he did not want to answer like this. There were hundreds of old, weak, women and children between him and the Abbey Dean. For him, these old, weak, women and children were thousands of people. Passing through the thousands of people, he looked into the Abbey Dean's eyes and said, if heaven does not obey, then just destroy it. Compared with his answer to Lotus years ago, his answer today was calmer and more certain. It was not because he had the confidence to defeat the Abbey Dean, nor was it because he wanted to show his arrogance. It was because he had really thought through the truth, so he was calm. Because if heaven did not obey the will of man, then the only way was to destroy heaven. No matter whether he would win or lose, he had to do it. Because, this was the truth of the academy. After saying this, he held the hilt and was ready to pull the padao out from the ground. With this movement, the slowly rotating liquid in his abdomen suddenly exploded and sprayed everywhere. The Great Spirit grew wildly like weeds, shaking its waist. Chang and City sensed the change on the snowy street. Endless chi of heaven and earth fell with the wind and snow, and poured into his body through the array pestle. His aura suddenly changed and began to climb toward the peak of the knowing destiny state. Note, the dog at home is sick and is urinating blood. It has been running outside for a whole day. I am not complaining, but updating very late. I want to explain to you. I will continue to write the second chapter. I hope I can finish it before 2:00. In addition, I strongly feel that the chapters in the second volume of Being Possessed by the Devil are worth revisiting. About Ning Ke teaching Sang Sang, do your own thing. This is a sentence my niece's kindergarten teacher taught her when she was young. At that time, whenever I wanted to help her with something, she always told me seriously, do your own thing, and vice versa. I love her very much, and I miss her very much. My dear, I know you will see this. Please say hello to your classmates for me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 803. The chi of heaven and earth in Chang and was so vast that it could not be calculated. At this moment, it was pouring into Ning Ke's body through the array pestle along his left hand. The chi of heaven and earth had no substance or quality. It was clearer than the clearest water and lighter than the lightest air. But there was too much of it entering his body, which naturally brought him an unbearable burden. If an ordinary person, even a cultivator at the peak of the knowing destiny state, had absorbed so much chi of heaven and earth in such a short period of time, he would have been crushed to death. But Ning Ke cultivated the Great Spirit and his body was stronger than steel. Except for the Abbey Dean who cultivated the Taoism, Buddhism and the Devil's Doctrine, and third sister Yu Lian who was the leader of the Devil's Doctrine, no one was stronger than him. His body was like a container made of stainless steel, which was used to make the primordial 13 arrows. It withstood the chi of heaven and earth and compressed it to an unimaginable degree. At this moment, he was like a seashell in the depths of the sea. His body and soul were under terrible pressure, but he did not know when they could condense into dazzling pearls. It was a very painful process. But he showed no expression on his face, except for his eyelashes that kept blinking and the snow on his clothes that kept melting. He just looked at the Abbey Dean. The wounds on his body opened up again, and blood gushed out. The blood was like red jade, and when it came into contact with the cold wind on the street, it dispersed into extremely fine particles. Those particles left the surface of his clothes and drifted in the air around him. They looked like flames or fog. He looked like a burning man, or an extremely cold man of ice. He continued to pull out his cutlass. The sharp blade slowly rose from the bluestone cracks on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, bringing out black mud and was about to leave the snow. Many things happened in Chang'an. In the early morning, the Abbey Dean waved his sleeves to break the stone array tactics, entered the city, and defeated the eldest brother and third sister of the academy. Then many divine talismans appeared in front of him, telling him that it was a dead end. From that moment until he saw the Abbey Dean in the wind and snow on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, Ning Ke went to many places in Chang'an and erased many traces left by Haotian in the God-stunning array. Though he didn't completely repair the God-stunning array, he left behind enough divine talismans. Those divine talismans were formed by 2 knife marks, which looked like the Chinese character E. These divine talismans put the Abbey Dean in a difficult position. They prevented him from entering the imperial palace and destroying the eye of the god-stunning array. They forced him to walk into the wind and snow on the Vermilion Bird Avenue and kill Ning Ke first. Ning Ke was seriously injured by the 7 natural stream magical fingers. He did not continue to write the Talisman of Yi because it was meaningless. However, the hundreds of talismans he wrote did not disappear. Instead, they continued to float in the streets and alleys of Chang and under the support of the god-stunning array and gradually disappeared into the wind and snow. As he unsheathed his sword, hundreds of Yi talismans reappeared. On the street, at the end of the alley. In the well, in front of the yamen. Behind the wall, in the garden. Under the willows, beside the plum trees. Hundreds of Yi talismans reappeared in Chang'an. Inconceivably, these divine talismans were still changing. To be precise, these Yi talismans were changing shape. These Yi talismans were formed by 2 knife marks, which were 2 strokes. 1 stroke and 1 stroke. As Ning Ke unsheathed his sword, the stroke slowly rose to the right, as if it was going to float away from the stroke. This stroke was like an arrow. The invisible bowstring was pulled back, farther and farther away from the bow, and at the same time, it was accumulating more and more power. It was also like a knife that was leaving the ground and was about to show its sharpness. Unsheathing a sword was a very simple action. Ning Ke had repeated it countless times in his life. He was very familiar with it, so he finished it in a very short time. The changes in the streets and alleys of Chang'an also happened in a very short time. The situation suddenly changed. The first person to feel the changes in Ning Ke and Chang'an was not the Abbey Dean, eldest brother, or the people on the snowy street. It was the sky above their heads. The water at the bottom of the well at the entrance of the alley had long been frozen. Suddenly, 2 knife marks appeared. 2 knife marks appeared on the snow-covered bell, and 2 knife marks appeared on the Yanming Lake. The water in the well began to ripple again, and so did the sound of the bell. The willow branches by the Yanming Lake began to sway in the cold wind. Thick snow fell from the pine trees in the Tantua Temple. A fat squirrel sat on the food for the winter under its buttocks and kept rubbing its forelimbs. It did not understand why it was frozen before. The aura that enveloped the lakes, mountains, pagodas and temples instantly disappeared as hundreds of Yi talismans reappeared and changed shape. Even the falling snow suddenly stopped, and the frozen Chang'an came back to life. The unknown aura continued to spread around with Ning Ke's action. At the same time, it rushed to the sky, wildly dispersing the thick snow clouds. The blue sky reappeared. When the headmaster of the academy left the human world, the Abbey Dean was the first in the world. The sky was the first to feel this change, and he was the second to feel it. He sensed the danger. His eyes suddenly became lighter than gray, until they were transparent, like crystals. There were countless lights and shadows moving at a high speed in them, as if many stories were happening on the screen. He saw some scenes that he could not believe. In Chang'an, the Abbey Dean could not see the future clearly, just as he could not see what the academy would become in the future. However, he once saw some scenes that he firmly believed. But those scenes changed. At the moment when Ning Ke pulled out his knife, the snow stopped, and the wind stopped. The Vermilion Bird Avenue was very quiet. The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Quebec. His eyes returned to normal, but there was a touch of surprise left behind. He believed in Taoism, and he had no love or hate for things like killing. Today, the Abbey Dean had killed countless people. He had his reasons and his needs. He wanted to kill Ning Ke previously because of his needs. However, he wanted to kill Ning Ke now because of an inexplicable vigilance. This vigilance was so strong that it even caused his Dao heart to sway slightly. He wanted to kill Ning Quebec. This desire was almost an instinct. But he sensed that there was something hidden in the air between him and Ning Quebec. He could not enter the limitless state, so he could not kill Ning Ke in the shortest time. So he could not let Ning Ke raise that knife at least. The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Ke and said, "Those who believe in Ning Ke did not know why he spoke at this time." The disciples of the academy in front of the verdant canyon would definitely think of the West Hill scriptures that the great divine priest of Revelation had read. It was the Taoist divine skill that was as famous as the Xiankong Temple's chief preaching monk's words. Ning Ke did not die. Because the Abbey Dean only had time to say these 3 words. Because eldest brother said these 3 words at the same time, Z does not speak. After saying these 3 words, his face suddenly turned pale, and more blood flowed out of his cotton-padded jacket. Ning Ke finally pulled out his knife after such a short delay. The blade completely left the snow. Looking at the knife in his hand, the Abbey Dean took a step back. Retreating meant leaving. For thousands of years, he was the only one who had killed his way into Chang'an. He was about to destroy the God-stunning array, the Tang Empire and the Academy, and achieve a great achievement. As long as he could kill Ning Ke, he could achieve all of this. For the Abbey Dean, this was a very simple thing, and naturally a great temptation. But he wanted to leave. Without any hesitation, without any reluctance. Only a person with a truly bright Taoist heart could do this. There was no wind or snow on the street. The Abbey Dean could not move forward, so he stepped back. His right foot stepped on the ground, and wind and snow appeared under his foot. An invisible door appeared in the wind and snow. The door could only be seen by people in the limitless state. The Abbey Dean's right foot stepped into the door, and his indigo robe suddenly became transparent. The next moment, he was about to step into the void. The chi of heaven and earth in Chang'an had been disturbed by Ning Ke, but it still could not stop him from leaving. Ning Ke was not going to let him leave. Because he had already pulled out his knife. When the blade left the snow, it made a very faint sound, like a brush dipped in oil brushing across a piece of meat that had been roasted over a bonfire, or like a brush dipped in ink sliding across a snow-white paper. Hundreds of soft sounds were heard in the streets and alleys of Chang'an, and beside the willows and plum trees. It was like the sound of a zither, like the sound of a bowstring, and most like the sound of a blade being unsheathed. That was the sound of friction between the skimming and pressing. It was the sound of hundreds of talismans. Then, there were more sounds of blades being unsheathed. This time, it was a real sound. Dozens of pig slaughtering knives hanging on the wall of the Eastern City pork shop had been lonely in their leather sheaths for a day and a night. Suddenly, they broke out of their sheaths. Not far from Vermilion Bird Avenue, there was a sharp knife stabbed into a chopping board in a certain house. The knife was stained with fresh blood. Not far away, there was a pot of stewed meat steaming. Suddenly, the kitchen knife jumped out of the chopping board. 2 teenagers were lying in a pool of blood beside the Vermilion Bird Avenue. They were seriously injured and leaned against the wall that was wet with snow. Although they were not dead, they could no longer hold the knives and forks beside them. Suddenly, the 2 choppers and the kitchen knife jumped out of the snow and landed beside their hands. Ning Ke pulled out his knife. All the knives in Chang'an were pulled out. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of knives began to show their sharpness. The winter willows by the Yanming Lake were fluttering. The pine trees in the Tantua Temple were bowing. The snow on the whetstone floated up. One of the lines among the hundreds of divine talismans moved very slightly. The snow on the long street was blurred, and countless sharp auras suddenly appeared. The invisible door was cut into pieces in an instant. Countless tiny cracks appeared on the Abbey Dean's indigo robe. Many cracks also appeared on his powerful body that was forged from the heavenly demon realm. The Abbey Dean began to bleed, a lot of blood. Ning Ke raised his knife and said, "I want to kill you." As he spoke, the absolutely condensed chi of heaven and earth spurted out from his lips and turned into a half-foot-long white mist. There were tiny flashes of thunder and lightning in the mist, as well as his strong desire. 2 more chapters tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 804. Ning Ke didn't say, "I want to kill you." Instead, he said, "I want to kill you." He seemed very careful. But his calmness and prudence showed that he really wanted to do it. Because this was the desire of everyone in Chang'an City. He wanted to fulfill this desire, so he said that sentence very seriously, and at the same time, he issued his own call or request. As if hearing his call, a loud and clear chirp suddenly sounded in the south of the street. The wind and snow on the Vermilion Bird Avenue had stopped, but the snow was still there. The Vermilion Bird painting, which had frightened Ning Ke and Sang Sang in the spring rain, was now buried in the deep snow, as if it had been frozen and lifeless. The Vermilion Bird painting was the killing talisman of the God-stunning array. It had an unimaginable spirituality. When it operated on its own, it could have the most powerful strike of a powerhouse at the peak of knowing destiny. 1,000 years ago, it was carved by the headmaster in the south of the Vermilion Bird Avenue to guard this great capital. Countless demons and evil spirits were quietly burned to ashes by it in the dark night. When the Abbey Dean entered Chang'an, the Vermilion Bird painting sensed him. When it was about to show itself to fight, the Abbey Dean stepped on its wings. It was just a simple step, but it didn't dare to move. Because the Vermilion Bird sensed the gap between their states, it felt scared. So it lowered its once proud head and buried itself in the cold snow, too ashamed to see anyone. Until then, a voice suddenly came to the deepest part of its soul. The voice said that he wanted to kill the Abbey Dean, so he needed its help. The Vermilion Bird knew who the voice was, but it couldn't think of anyone who could kill someone like the Abbey Dean after the headmaster left the human world. So it was still timid. But the voice kept echoing in the deepest part of its soul, rubbing against it and burning it like surging magma. It was so irritated that even its blood started to burn. The timidity from a moment ago turned into shame. Something called courage returned to the Vermilion Bird. The snow was blown away by the wind, revealing its eyes. A majestic aura rose on the street. The wings of the Vermilion Bird painting broke through the snow and stones and appeared in the sky. With an extremely clear cry, the Vermilion Bird's body left the street and soared into the sky. The Vermilion Bird hadn't chirped for 1,000 years. Would today's cry be able to shock the gods? The Vermilion Bird spread its 100 feet long wings and flew across the sky, arriving at the south gate of Chang'an in an instant. The city walls towered into the clouds, and the bricks were old. The Vermilion Bird flew between the city walls. It flapped its scarlet wings, as if dragging two flames behind it. It stuck close to the city wall and flew at high speed. In an extremely short amount of time, it arrived in the north. The Vermilion Bird flew above the imperial palace. The empress held the little emperor's hand and bowed slightly to the sky. Yu Lian raised an eyebrow in the corner tower of the royal city. The Vermilion Bird flew over the imperial palace, lowered its altitude, and dove south along Vermilion Bird Avenue. This world's straightest and widest road was its path. The Vermilion Bird flew extremely fast on this road. Its wings, which were more than 100 feet long, seemed to be setting Chang'an on fire. Wherever it touched, the snow suddenly turned into smoke. No one on the snowy street could react. They only heard a clear sound, and then they saw a fiery shadow approaching. No one had time to think, not even the Abbey Dean. When he saw clearly that it was the Vermilion Bird flying on the street, he could not help but show a mocking expression. The Abbey Dean rarely showed emotions like ordinary people, but he could never suppress his mockery and contempt for the legendary Vermilion Bird. Even he himself could not figure out the reason. Perhaps it was because the Vermilion Bird was the only thing left by the headmaster in the human world. The Vermilion Bird flew on the snowy street, flapping its wings. The blazing flames burned the air and made a crackling sound. The whole world seemed to turn into a fiery red color. Just when the Tangs were expecting the Vermilion Bird to kill the Abbey Dean, and the Abbey Dean was about to tear off the vermilion bird's fiery wings. The vermilion bird gave a clear cry again. A flame flashed. The vermilion bird quietly withdrew its aura, turned into a flame, and fell on Ning Kei's cutlass. There was a slight burning sound, as if a soldering iron had been stamped somewhere. Ning Kei's cutlass had some black burn marks in a very distinct pattern. It was a firebird with a bright red body. Ning Kei's iron cutlass was the combination of the 3 cutlasses that had accompanied him for many years. Just like the primordial 13 arrows, it was the crystallization of the collective wisdom of the Academy, possessing unimaginable strength and weight. Only such a strong cutlass could withstand the great power in his body. However, with the improvement of his cultivation realm, this saber was not as useful to him as the 3 sabers he had in the past, the primordial 13 arrows, and the inexhaustible talisman paper. Sometimes, it even became his weakness. Ning Kei was very good at fighting. He clearly knew how troublesome it was to be unable to balance the weapon in his hand with his own strength. But he never gave up on this cutlass. Because in the darkness, he always felt that this blade should belong to him, and that one day, it would reveal its true sharpness. When this cutlass was made, he even refused 4th brother's and 6th brother's suggestion to carve talismans on the cutlass to increase its power like most of the powerful cultivators in the world did. Because he felt that the talismans he wrote back then were not powerful enough. Using them on the iron cutlass was equivalent to destroying the cutlass. Even though he could write divine talismans now, he still felt that it was not enough. There was no reason. He just felt that the talisman that was qualified to be carved on this cutlass must be extraordinary. So the iron cutlass had always been dim, without any talisman lines carved on it. The heavy cutlass looked so simple and unadorned, but it was constantly soaked in blood. Until today, with a clear cry from the south of Chang'an, the vermilion bird broke through the sky and turned into a flame falling on the cutlass. Then, a bright red pattern appeared on the black cutlass. Ning Kei then realized that it was what he had been waiting for. He then understood why the headmaster of the academy let him meet the vermilion bird before he left the human world. It must be an extraordinary talisman that matched this iron cutlass. This talisman was the vermilion bird. It was the killing talisman in the god-stunning array. The cutlass had been pulled out of the snow. Ning Kei raised the cutlass, and the snow suddenly scattered. The vermilion bird divine talisman on the black cutlass suddenly lit up. A bright red flame spurted out from the edge of the cutlass, piercing the sky. At this time, the wind and snow had long disappeared, and the blue sky was revealed to countless eyes in the human world. The bright red flame that the cutlass spurted out was more than 10 miles long. As Ning Kei raised the cutlass, it dragged from the northeast to the southwest in the blue sky. As the flames dragged on, a mark was left in the blue sky. It was as if someone had taken a mountain-like brush and written heavily in the sky. This stroke crossed half of the sky, and no one knew how many thousands of miles. Ning Kei lowered the cutlass, and the flame from the blade moved down. He began to write the second stroke. In the corner tower of the imperial city. Yu Lian looked at the sky quietly, watching the flame moving between the sky and the earth. Then she glanced at the cutlass in her hand. It was a huge blood-red cutlass, even as long and wide as her petite body. This blood-red cutlass was the sacred relic of the Devil's Doctrine. After the desolate men moved south, it had been kept by Tang Xiaotang. As the Grand Master of the Devil's Doctrine, it was natural for Yu Lian to have this cutlass. When the Abbey Dean walked on the snowy street, she came to the imperial palace for this cutlass. Judging from its appearance, the blood-colored giant blade in her hand was definitely more terrifying than the one in Ning Kei's hand, and it gave people a stronger sense of deterrence. But she knew that compared to the one in Ning Kei's hand, her blood cutlass was inferior. Ning Kei's cutlass could write in the sky. You finally wrote that word. Yu Lian looked at the word that was gradually taking shape in the blue sky, and suddenly took a deep breath. The snow around the imperial city floated up from the ground as she breathed. The ice in the moat cracked and broke into countless pieces. Air poured into her petite body between her breaths. Her chest rose and fell slightly. Her eyes gradually brightened. Everyone on the snowy street was looking at the sky. Everyone in Chang'an was looking at the sky. They were looking at the giant brush formed by flames, riding in the blue sky. Eldest brother was also looking at the sky. There was no snow falling, but his eyes were a little wet. He looked at the sky and said quietly, "Teacher." Youngest brother finally wrote that word. Then he took a deep breath. Nothing changed on the snowy street. Even the withered leaves that fell on the snow did not tremble a bit during his breath. His eyes gradually brightened. His cotton-padded jacket continued to ooze blood. The wooden ladle broke in front of the Pamir Mountains. The wooden stick was held in his hand. He did not know where he put the old book. The belt on the cotton-padded jacket no longer needed to be tied with so many things and worries. So it began to float, drawing many residual shadows. Ning Ke looked at the Abbey Dean and cut. Because the cutlass in his hand was bound to fall on the Abbey Dean. So he had to cut more accurately. His eyes met with the Abbey Dean's in the street. He did not see any other emotions in the Abbey Dean's eyes, only calmness. The snowflakes floating in the air also became calm. The extremely faint sound of the snow pressing against each other began to become muffled. Time began to slow down. Then he heard the Abbey Dean's voice in his sense of perception. "Your strokes are wrong." Ning Ke was not worried. Because no one could really control the rules of time except for the Buddha. Not even the Abbey Dean. Even if he slowed down time with his great divine power, he was still in the process of slowing down time. That meant no matter how slow the iron cutlass fell, it would reach the moment eventually. He said to the Abbey Dean, "The strokes are wrong, but it doesn't mean the words are wrong." The Abbey Dean's voice disappeared for a moment and then sounded again. His voice was full of emotion and complicated emotions. "Good writing. There is one more chapter. I will continue. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 805. I never understood why the headmaster accepted you as his last disciple. Although you had many adventures and entered the knowing destiny state early, which is indeed extraordinary for ordinary cultivators in the world, you are not even as good as my son Pippi, let alone Li Man, Jun Mo, and Lin Wu. What right do you have to be the last trace left by the headmaster in the human world? The Abbey Dean said, "It was not until you wrote this word that I realized the headmaster was the headmaster after all." He had never made a wrong choice other than being Haotian's enemy. At this time, the snow on the street was like a lead ball, slowly falling. Time was still moving very slowly. Ning Ke listened to the voice in his sense of perception and naturally thought of his headmaster who was still fighting in the sky. The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Quebec. At first, he was ready to kill him. But when he saw Ning Ke take out the cutlass, he decided to kill him. At least he could not let Ning Ke take out the cutlass. When Ning Ke took out the cutlass, he wanted to retreat, but he was trapped by countless cutlasses in Chang'an. When the vermilion bird attached to the iron cutlass and Ning Ke started to write the big word in the sky, he decided to choose another way out. The state gap between him and Ning Ke was too big. Even if Ning Ke could write that word, he might not be able to defeat him. The real reason why he decided to retreat at all costs was because of what he saw. Earlier, he saw a deep dark night. It's a pity that the stroke order of the word is wrong, and you can't finish it in time. Then when I want to leave, no one can stop me. The Abbey Dean said and then opened his arms solemnly, as if he was welcoming something. As he moved, the speed of time on the snow street returned to normal. The Abbey Dean's fingers trembled in the cold wind. 3 of his fingers on his left hand had been cut off by Yu Lian's cicada wings. At this time, he opened his arms to embrace the sky, and only 7 fingers remained in the sky. They were the 7 Tianqi. The majestic power and tranquil light fell on the snow street, on the Abbey Dean, or more precisely on his fingers. 7 rays of clear light fell on his fingers. The clear light fell on the fingers and suddenly changed. The clear light on the Abbey Dean's right thumb turned red, the clear light on the index finger turned orange, and the clear light on the other fingers also changed colors. Red, orange, yellow, green, cyan, blue and purple. When the 7 heavenly lights combined, they became a rainbow. A rainbow appeared in Chang'an. One end of the rainbow was on the snowy street, rising steeply from the ground, reaching extremely high into the sky. Then, it drew a perfectly round arc, landing somewhere outside the city. This rainbow contained unimaginable power. The street shook uneasily, and the bluestone slabs cracked inch by inch. The people who were standing fell to the ground one after another. The remaining snow and dirty water were all shaken into powder. The Abbey Dean's figure disappeared from the snowy street. He flew with the wind and arrived in the sky along the rainbow. The sky was very big. Although the word written by Ning Ke with the vermilion bird blade was also very big, it could not occupy the entire sky, leaving enough space for the rainbow. His saber had not chopped down, and he had not finished writing the word in the blue sky. His blade carried the longing of millions of people, and this longing was extremely heavy. Perhaps it was because of this heaviness that it was somewhat slow. And the Abbey Dean was about to step on the rainbow and go thousands of miles away. This was a great divine ability. The sky was huge, really huge. No matter how great a bird was, it was impossible to fly across the entire sky. No matter how far one's vision was, it was impossible to see the end of the sky. There were countless cuts and talisman intents in the city. The chi of heaven and earth was already in disorder. It was difficult for the Abbey Dean to leave. Therefore, he came to the sky, thinking that no one could stop him. But the sky was also very small, so small that birds would sometimes collide with each other. It was so small that people who lived under the sky sometimes found it difficult to breathe. A hand appeared in the sky and held the Abbey Dean's foot. The hand was very clean, and the nails were also very clean. There was no blood or dirt. The hand was very steady and firm, as if it was playing the zither. There was no trembling at all. It was the eldest brother's hand. In the wilderness, Sang Sang was summoned by Haotian's divine kingdom and gradually floated to the sky. Ning Ke held her waist and followed her to leave the human world. The headmaster stood on the ground and reached out to hold his foot. He reached out to hold the Abbey Dean's hand because he did not want him to leave. The eldest brother did not want the Abbey Dean to leave either. He and the Abbey Dean had been chasing each other in the human world for 7 days and 7 nights. How could he let the Abbey Dean go when the end was near? He was the eldest brother of the academy. He looked gentle and dull, but he had real wisdom. He had a pure heart. He knew the Abbey Dean's real state and the Taoist heart of the Abbey Dean better than Ning Quebec. He knew that the Abbey Dean would leave at all costs after Ning Ke wrote that word. Therefore, he was prepared in advance. He took a breath. The withered leaves did not tremble. Only the belt around his waist fluttered. That was the sign of entering the limitless state. When the Abbey Dean stepped on the rainbow and flew to the blue sky, he chased after him. He had never been so close to the blue sky, nor so far from the earth. He reached the blue sky with the limitless state, but he might not be able to return to the earth safely. He chased after the Abbey Dean with his life, again and again. The eldest brother was not the only one who was prepared in advance. Yu Lian was also prepared. She stood in the turret of the imperial palace and looked at the word that was gradually completed in the blue sky. She took a deep breath. As she breathed, the snow and ice cracked. Countless chilly air poured into her body. Then, all the air was spat out from between her lips. The air rubbed against each other at high speed, making a heart-palpitating scream. She bent her knees slightly and sent all the strength in her body to her feet. In the rumbling sound, the sturdy turret collapsed. Smoke and dust filled the air. A petite figure broke through the smoke and flew straight to the blue sky like a stone thrown out by a catapult. She came to the blue sky. Against the backdrop of the vast sky, her figure seemed especially petite. The blood-red machete in her hand was still so ridiculously huge. The blood-red machete chopped down toward the rainbow. The blade and the rainbow collided. Golden and jade-like chips flew out. Although the blood-red machete was a sacred relic of the devil's doctrine, it was still rapidly eroded when contending against the pure Tianqi light. There was a crisp sound of paper being torn. The blood-red machete turned into an iron rod. The rainbow bridge connecting Chang and city broke in the middle and began to collapse. The Abbey Dean fell from the blue sky. The eldest brother was still holding the Abbey Dean's foot. Yu Lian also began to fall. Like 3 meteorites. There was a loud rumbling sound. The 3 landed on the snow street. The remaining snow suddenly scattered, and the smoke and dust rose. Vaguely, it could be seen that Yu Lian was holding the eldest brother in her arms. If not, the eldest brother would have been killed by the earthquake falling from the sky, no matter how high his state was. However, even though she was the current grandmaster of the devil's doctrine and possessed unimaginable strength and physical strength, she was still seriously injured by such a terrible impact and protecting the eldest brother. Blood flowed from her ankle. She might have broken a bone. The Abbey Dean was indeed the most powerful person in Taoism for 1,000 years. He fell from the sky as if nothing had happened. He reached out and cast another Tianqi. A majestic power fell from the sky. Yu Lian turned her jade-like hands and 2 transparent cicada wings appeared on the snow street. The power of Tianqi bombarded the cicada wings. There was a crisp crack. Yu Lian's wrists were all broken. It was an unbearable pain, but she was still expressionless and kept holding the sky with one hand. The eldest brother was dying. She had to hold up the sky. Killing the Abbey Dean in Cheng and was what the Academy wanted and had to do. In the original plan, the eldest brother and she had made, Ning Ke should repair the God-stunning array and at least trap the Abbey Dean in a specific position. Then she and the eldest brother would burn their lives to launch the strongest attack. However, things never went according to plan. Ning Ke could not repair the God-stunning array in time. The Abbey Dean was more powerful than the Academy had imagined. Fortunately, Ning Ke could write that character now. Then what the eldest brother and Yu Lian needed to do was to trap the Abbey Dean and leave the chance for Ning Ke to kill him. A rainbow fell. The Abbey Dean went straight up to the sky. And then fell to the dust. Ning Ke's cutlass finally arrived. The iron cutlass was very black, and the vermilion bird pattern was dark red. The vermilion bird was the full power of the knowing destiny state. At this time, the chi of heaven and earth in Chang and entered Ning Ke's body through the array eye pestle and then transferred to the iron cutlass. The power of the cutlass had already surpassed the 5 states. A hurricane suddenly rose on the snow street. The cutlass wind was everywhere. All the debris on the street was rolled up by the cutlass wind and chopped toward the Abbey Dean. The view on the street became dark. The Abbey Dean's figure suddenly faded away and disappeared. Only the sound of wind and collision could be heard. Countless sharp cutlasses broke through the air. The chi of heaven and earth generated countless dangerous turbulence, and some places even had large-scale distortions. Every distortion was like a mirror. Knives could be seen in some mirrors. A faint figure could be seen in some mirrors. A cyan Taoist robe could be seen in some mirrors. A piece of the cyan robe fell on the street. The Abbey Dean landed on the street. He was covered in blood, and no one knew how many cutlasses had cut him. Blood was flowing, and there were countless cuts. Some of the cuts were deep, some were shallow, and the shapes were different. The flesh on some parts of his body was almost cut off, revealing the ghastly white bones. He looked extremely miserable. Ning Ke's cutlass penetrated all the chi of heaven and earth. No matter where the Abbé Dean was hiding, he would be cut out by Ning Quebec. When the cutlass reached his body, the Abbé Dean used the boundless state of the Buddhism sect, just like the previous 2 times. However, this time was different from the previous 2 times. Because Ning Ke had more than one cutlass. He borrowed a cutlass from everyone in Chang and City. All the cutlasses in Chang and City fell on the Abbé Dean. The sea was boundless, and the number of cutlasses was innumerable. The Abbé Dean killed thousands of people on this street. Therefore, he was cut into pieces on this street. He let out an extremely shrill and mournful scream. He was in extreme pain. "Old master, I didn't embarrass you. The person who embarrassed me was Chen Mao. He was in pain." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 806. In the roar, the Abbé Dean came to Ning Quebec. Every step on the snow street was stained with blood. Yu Lian cut off the rainbow bridge, and eldest brother held his feet. He could not leave Chang and City by air, so he had to take Ning Ke's blade. At this moment, he was as miserable as a sinner who had been sentenced to death by dismemberment. He was covered with blood and bones, but he still thought he could take the blade. The Abbé Dean was still flying like an immortal, a white bone immortal. He pointed at the blade. He looked solemn, like a king of the divine kingdom walking in the human world. His aura suddenly changed and became extremely awe-inspiring. An aura colder than the abyss and lonelier than death passed from his fingertips to the blade of the iron cutlass. In an instant, the blade was covered with a layer of frost. What a strong aura of quietus! The vermilion bird let out an angry roar and spewed out endless flames to fight against the quietus. The front end of the iron cutlass was colder than ice, emitting a terrifying quietus aura. It was covered with frost, while the other end near Ning Ke's right hand was extremely hot, emitting flames to the outside world. 2 extreme auras were making the most dangerous resistance on such a simple and plain cutlass. No one knew if the iron cutlass would be frozen into scrap iron or burn all the quietus in the world in the next moment. At this moment, a clear sound was heard in the hurricane that the iron cutlass stirred up on the snow street. It was the sound of metal objects colliding, and then more and more colliding sounds were heard. The wind of the cutlass swept through the street and surged between the streets and markets. No one knew how many things were rolled up, such as iron pots, broken gongs, and musical instruments like flutes. The gongs were hit by stones, the thick iron pots hit the walls, and the flutes started to whimper due to the wind. There were lively sounds in the dim wind, and no one knew who was having a wedding or a funeral. With these sounds, the frost on the front end of the iron cutlass disappeared at a speed visible to the naked eye, while the flames spewed by the vermilion bird cut toward the Abbé Dean along the blade. The quietus was broken by the bustle of the human world. The fierce wind set up by the iron cutlass turned the Vermilion Bird Avenue into the storm sea in the east of the Song Kingdom. The Abbé Dean's quietus aura was broken, and his indigo robe fluttered in the wind. He stood up ostentatiously, and his body seemed to become countless times bigger. An aura as vast and boundless as the sea appeared on the snowy street. The Abbé Dean used the boundless sea of the Buddhism sect again. The pain of being dismembered made him very clear that if he only used the boundless state of the Buddhism sect, it would not be enough to resist the knife in Ning Ke's hand, because there were thousands of knives. Therefore, he used the Divine Demon Realm at the same time. The Divine Demon Realm was a unique skill of the Devil's Doctrine. Apart from Yu Lian, only the Abbé Dean knew it. Apart from making the body of a cultivator stronger than steel, more importantly, it could create a new world, or in other words, a false world. What would happen if the Buddhist sect's Limitless and the Devil's sect's Sky Demon Realm were used at the same time? Dean. Ning Ke came to the coast of the East Sea and stood on the seawall that stretched for miles. The East Sea Causeway of the Kingdom of Song was very famous. He didn't look at the strangely shaped rocks under his feet. Instead, He looked silently at the seemingly boundless sea outside the causeway. There were countless storms in the depths of the sea. The seawater nearby was stirred like ink, with a chilling sense of danger. Waves as high as a 10-story building were set off in the distance. Ning Ke did not slash at the waves. Because the Abbey Dean was not a storm. The storm came from his iron cutlass. The Abbey Dean was the sea. No matter how terrible the storm was, it could never destroy the sea itself. The vermilion bird chirped in the gloomy sky. Holding a small stone in its mouth, the little red bird flew to the depths of the sea against the storm. No matter how violent the storm was, it could not be stopped. The vermilion bird became a little black dot in the sky. It took the small stone in its mouth and threw it into the sea. The stone fell into the raging sea and was swallowed instantly. It did not even make a noticeable splash. The vermilion bird was not discouraged. It chirped and flew back to the shore. Holding another stone in its mouth, it flew to the depths of the sea against the storm. The bird shuttled back and forth between the gloomy sky and the raging sea. Behind the seawall, more than half of a mountain had collapsed. At the foot of the mountain, there were people hammering at the rocks. The hard rocks were smashed to the size of the vermilion bird's mouth. There were many people smashing stones, so many that it was hard to count. Many of them came from the Wa Mountain. In recent years, they had smashed the collapsed Buddha statues into countless small Buddha statues and sold them to tourists. They were good at this kind of thing. Human beings were good at this kind of thing. Human beings were good at cutting mountains and smashing all the hard things in the world. Behind the sea wall, the dull sound of smashing stones kept ringing for many days and nights. People smashed stones tirelessly, and the vermilion bird flew back and forth between the sea and the land tirelessly. Countless small stones were thrown into the sea by the vermilion bird. This was reclamation. The sea was immeasurable. But as long as it kept filling, it would be filled up one day. The immeasurable was broken by the immeasurable of the human world. The Abbey Dean became a barren field. It had been raining heavily for half a year. It was said that the flood was a punishment from Haotian. Anyone who disrespected Haotian would die in this terrible disaster. If one wanted to avoid the flood, he had to walk through the wilderness. However, the wilderness was covered with knee-high weeds and muddy marshes. Some places seemed safe, but dangerous quicksand was hidden. Even the most ferocious beasts did not dare to walk in the wilderness. The first person came to the periphery of the wilderness. He was hesitant because there was no road in the wilderness. He did not know how to walk and what was the right way. More and more people came to the wilderness. They wanted to walk through the wilderness and find a new world. However, like the first person, they did not know where the road was. They discussed for a long time and even began to quarrel, but they could not come up with an idea. Please make way. A young man squeezed through the crowd and walked into the wilderness. His luggage was simple. The only useful thing was probably the rusty chopper in his hand. What was more worrying was that he was carrying a skinny little girl on his back. People tried to persuade him that it was dangerous in the wilderness. The most important thing was that there was no road. The young man ignored them and continued to walk into the wilderness. He only held the chopper in his hand tighter. Looking at the back of the young man disappearing in the weeds of the wilderness, the crowd was silent for a long time. Someone tightened the luggage on his back and followed him into the wilderness. Someone supported his tired body with a branch and also walked in. More and more people walked into the wilderness. Some were bitten to death by the poisonous snakes in the swamp, some sank into the depths of the quagmire, and some became dried corpses under the quicksand. However, there were even more people who successfully walked through the wilderness and went to a new world. There was no road in the world. As long as more people walked, there would be a road. The divine demon realm was broken by the persistence of the human world. The Abbey Dean displayed three states at the same time. The nirvana of Taoism, the immeasurable of Buddhism, and the divine demon realm of Devil's doctrine. These three states were all above the 5 states. Ning Ke simply chopped. One chop broke them all. The Abbey Dean's finger was still on the blade. The snow and frost on the iron blade had disappeared. The momentum of the blade and the blazing flame were gone with the wind. There was a thin cut on the Abbey Dean's finger. Then, more than 10 extremely miserable cuts appeared on his body. Some of the flesh that had been cut was blown away by the wind, while others drooped outwards, exposed to the dusky wind. Blood flowed down from his body like a waterfall. He looked very miserable. He looked so miserable that it was impossible for him to live. But the Abbey Dean was still alive. The most powerful person in Taoism for thousands of years would not die so easily. But he was only one step away from death, or returning to Haotian's divine kingdom. If he could not resist Ning Ke's thousands of cuts, then everything would be over. The Abbey Dean had looked down on the world all his life and had rarely felt the shadow of death. He was defeated by Kuharan's sword once. He was hit by the headmaster's wooden stick once. But even these 2 times, he survived and went further on the path of cultivation. Only the great fear between life and death could give a person like the Abbey Dean a chance to understand Tao. Today, he saw the abyss between life and death again in front of Ning Ke's blade. Could he understand something? The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Ke with a very strange expression on his face. It was not indifferent regret, nor anger. It had nothing to do with unwillingness. It was not an expression that a human should have. It was extremely calm and showed indifference. The deepest part of the indifference was not coldness, but emptiness. There was no emotion. An emotionless expression should not be called an expression. But Ning Ke felt that it was, and he was very vigilant. There was no emotion in the Abbey Dean's eyes, and even his pupils gradually faded. It was not faint like when he used the gray eyes, but really faint. The Abbey Dean's eyes were so faint that they were almost transparent. They were no longer jade, but tasteless water. Then he suddenly retracted his fingers. Ning Ke's iron cutlass fell down. Before the blade arrived, the wind had already started raging. His black hair danced in the wind, and blood scattered in the wind. The flesh that peeled off from his body was as red as flower petals. The ghastly white bones were as clean as lotus roots. The scene that should have been bloody looked extremely beautiful at this moment. He turned into a lotus. The blood could not be stained, and the dirt could not cover. It was extremely peaceful. It was extremely peaceful. The broken rainbow floated down from the blue sky and finally landed on the street. Some of them fell on the Abbey Dean, which suddenly glowed with golden jade and then slid off. These rainbow fragments were the remnant aura of Tianqi. But somehow, the power given by Haotian could not be integrated into the Abbey Dean's flesh and blood. The connection between the Abbey Dean and Haotian seemed to be broken. He seemed to have disappeared from heaven and earth, turning into snow and flowers that escaped. He was so independent and so untouchable. Looking at this scene, Yu Lian suddenly raised her eyebrows. Eldest brother said incredulously, "The state of pureness? The next chapter will be broken, but I don't know when it will be written. Anyway, it will be written. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 807. The state of pureness was said to be the most unfathomable state in Haotian Taoism, but no one had ever seen it, not even in the history of cultivation after the last everlasting night. For the real powerhouses in this world, there was one question that they were most curious about: how high was the headmaster of the academy? Master Qishan of the Lank Temple once guessed that the headmaster of the academy should be in the state of pureness. It could be imagined how high the state of pureness was in people's eyes. The headmaster of the academy proved his state in the wilderness, which was beyond everyone's imagination. But even he had never seen anyone enter the state of pureness in his long life. The eldest brother had never seen it either. His understanding of the state of pureness came from the scattered records in the books at the back of the mountain of the academy. It was only a guess that he shouted the words, state of pureness. He felt that his guess should not be far from the truth. There was no other way to explain the Abbey Dean's change except for the legendary state of pureness. Ning Ke wrote that character, gathered the desire of thousands of people in Chang'an, borrowed thousands of knives, and was about to kill the Abbey Dean. But the Abbey Dean actually entered the state of pureness. The eldest brother could not believe that someone in this world could enter this legendary state. But it happened so vividly in front of him. The Abbey Dean was indeed the most powerful powerhouse in Haotian Taoism in 1,000 years, the only one below Haotian. Compared to the other states, the state of pureness was a higher state. It could be called peerless, because it could be separated from the world. When one entered the state of pureness, all the power in the world became an absolute foreign object to the cultivator. The clear and beautiful sunlight shone on the cliffs, and the green pine trees cast their shadows on the rocks. If a cool breeze blew, it would shake the pine trees, or it would blow away the dust on the rocks, but how could it blow away the shadows? At this time, the Abbey Dean's flesh and blood were the lotus petals, and his bones were the lotus joints. He was born in the clear water, not in the world. Ning Ke's iron cutlass was still in the world. How could it fall on him? The iron cutlass could break 3 of the 5 states, but how could it break the state of pureness? The iron cutlass had cut through the quietus, the immeasurable, and the divine demon realm. Ning Ke's fighting will and spirit were at their peak at this moment. The terrifying chi of heaven and earth in his body seemed to be about to burst out. Because he knew, he would think and worry. Eldest senior brother was like that now. But he knew nothing. He did not know why the Abbey Dean was floating and why he looked much cleaner. So he did not think. He only knew that he was going to hack him to death. His iron saber finally came down completely. The iron cutlass finally finished writing that character in the blue sky with a flame of more than 10 li. Everything on the Vermilion Bird Avenue was rolled up by his blade wind and attacked the Abbey Dean. There were silver ingots and gold bars from the Yamen storeroom, flowers and birds from the calligraphy and painting shop, powder and a dozen hairpins, and an old incense burner from a small Taoist temple. There were iron pots and broken gongs, overnight tea in a teapot, urine in a chamber pot, half-eaten buns, minced meat with the smell of scallions, and feces and urine in the sewers. No matter if it was beautiful or ugly, sweet or stinky, pleasing or disgusting, it was the human world. Ning Ke's cutlass had cut out all the aura of the human world, including the filth. Everything was mixed together and no longer had different properties. It was no longer fragrant or stinky. What was the difference between silver ingots and a chamber pot? What was the difference between feces and gold bars? The Vermilion Bird Avenue was raging and became extremely dark. The entire Chang'an became extremely dark and then gradually turned dark. It seemed that the night was coming. On the long street that seemed to be shrouded in darkness, dull sounds of collisions could be heard. The Abbey Dean was like a pure lotus with bright red petals and white stems, swaying in the wind. Countless things from the human world hit his body. Minced meat with the smell of scallions fell on his face and then fell down, leaving some frozen meat juice on his beard and a small piece of scallion. A gold bar hit heavily on his chest, causing the petal-like flesh to tremble slightly. Then a mark was left on the gold bar. It was the mark of the national treasury of the Tang Empire. A chamber pot flew past his right shoulder, spilling disgusting yellow urine. A box of cosmetic powder scattered in front of him, splashing on his snow-white face. The Abbey Dean's body was covered in blood and filth. 2 rotten vegetable leaves hung on his belt, and there were several clusters of feces on the wounds of his broken fingers. He had become very dirty, very dirty. Even if he had not entered the state of pureness, he had never been so dirty in his life. He had lived above the human world and traveled in the South Sea. His feet were not stained by dust, but now he was forced to be baptized by the human world and be contaminated by all the aura of the human world. The filth from the human world was not only outside the body, but also outside the heart. The Abbey Dean was still in the state of pureness, unharmed. As long as he could keep his Taoist heart peaceful, his body and mind would be clean. However, his body and mind were the same. If his body had been contaminated by the human world for a long time, how could his heart remain peaceful? After countless years, or even several everlasting nights, the legendary state of pureness finally appeared in the human world again. What a shocking scene it was. However, what was even more shocking was that as soon as the state of pureness reappeared in the human world, it met the most powerful opponent in the world, the human world itself. The lotus swayed in the black wind, as if it could wither or die at any time. The Abbey Dean continued to fight against Ning Quebec. No one knew the result of the battle between the peerless state of Taoism and the human world. Even Haotian did not know. Jiang Rui was the most famous ruffian in Sanyuanli. He was good at cheating, but he was timid. He was even worse than the most useless ruffians, so even the young people looked down on him. He had no fixed residence and wandered around, so he did not receive any notice from the imperial court. In the early morning, he was awakened by the ringing of bells all over the city, and then he heard many noises in the wind. Jiang Rui did not know that it was the Abbey Dean fighting against the academy. He did not even know what was going on in Chang'an. But when he found that the streets were empty and the government runners of Chang and local government who usually patrolled the streets were nowhere to be seen, his remaining doubts were immediately diluted by ecstasy. He went to the Lotus Pond to steal several bolts of embroidered cloth from the South Jin Kingdom. When he found that a yaman's warehouse had collapsed, he was about to pick up some silver, but he hesitated because of fear. Although he was a ruffian, like other Tangs, he felt that dignity was very important. So when he returned to the small yard, he felt ashamed of his previous cowardice. In order not to feel ashamed, he decided to do something that he had wanted to do for a long time. He took out a sharp knife and sneaked into the yard of Li Zheng's house, ready to stab the big yellow dog that had bitten him when he was young. More than a decade had passed since that incident, and the big yellow dog from back then had already become an old yellow dog. It did not have the power to resist at all, and it died as soon as Yangming stabbed it with the sharp knife. Jiang Rui even doubted whether the old yellow dog was stabbed to death by himself or died of old age. Anyway, he had accomplished what he wanted to do the most in his life. He carried the old yellow dog back to the small yard and began to peel and cut it into pieces. Then he lit the stove and prepared to cook a pot of dog meat. At this time, he heard a conversation coming from the street. He could not understand the conversation, but then he heard two young people crying. He recognized that one of them should be the cold-eyed boy from the Zhang family. Jiang Rui held the top of the wall with both hands and looked at the street. Then he roughly understood what was happening in Chang'an. He was very scared and hurried back to the yard. He stared blankly at the unboiled water in the pot and the dog meat on the chopping board for a while. He stabbed the sharp knife into the chopping board and poured the bloody dog meat into the pot of water. He pushed down the old and loose wall that had not been repaired for many years, picked up a dozen bricks and held them in his arms. Then, with great difficulty, he climbed up the wall again, took out a brick and threw it at the Taoist priest on the street. He thought it was safer this way. Thinking of the pot of dog meat, he was a little angry and felt sorry for the old yellow dog. So he cursed at the Taoist priest. "I'll smash you to death, son of a bitch." Jiang Rui died just like that. No one would ever know that he had fulfilled the biggest wish of his life today. No one would ever know that half of the wall in the small yard had collapsed and the dog meat was cooking in the pot. The Abbey Dean's quietus will shrouded the whole Chang'an. The firewood in the stove was frozen out and the water in the pot no longer heated up. The dog meat in the water continued to soak like that and a lot of blood came out. Ning Ke pulled out his padao from the snowy street. The sharp knife on the chopping board in the small yard jumped up. The blood on the knife was still fresh. The pot not far away was steaming. A word appeared in the blue sky. A gust of wind blew on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. The world became extremely dark. Chang'an seemed to fall into the night ahead of time. The small yard was also in the dark. The black wind was very violent. It blew everywhere and broke the eaves in the marketplace. The remaining half of the wall in the small yard was also blown down. Even the dog meat pot on the stove was blown up. The dog meat pot was blown over the wall and onto the street. Then it fell on a person. It fell on the Abbey Dean. The pot of bloody dog meat was poured over the Abbey Dean's head. The blood and soup drenched his whole body. The dog meat fell on the Abbey Dean's broken body. If it were a lotus, the warm dog meat would be hanging on the petals. The petals were dripping with blood. The Abbey Dean's body was dirty, and then his heart was dirty. The peace of Taoism was finally broken by the secular world. The Abbey Dean's eyes were filled with confusion. "I'm going to kill you," Ning Ke said. His iron cutlass chopped on the Abbey Dean's left shoulder, his real body. Even though the state of peace was broken, the Abbey Dean's state of divine demon was extremely profound and almost immortal. So he chopped with great force. He bent his left knee slightly. The Howran Chi was like a storm. Countless Chi of heaven and earth poured into the iron cutlass and dragged it down obliquely. It cut a horrible wound on the Abbey Dean's body. The pure lotus was rolled up by the black wind and gradually withered. Then the petals fell. Ning Ke's knife contained the vicissitudes of Chang and for thousands of years and the desire of thousands of people. The Abbey Dean was directly chopped into dust and floated to the south of the long street. Blood spilled along the way. Hundreds of talismans in the streets of Chang and fell on him again. Thousands of cutlasses in Chang and city chopped on him at the same time. Under the dark night, in the wind of the cutlass. The Abbey Dean's 7 fingers fell like lotus roots. Then his legs left his body. His abdomen split open and his intestines were broken. The dog blood and feces entered the deepest part of his body and could not be washed away. A human-shaped hole appeared on the south city gate with a bang. The Abbey Dean flew out of Chang and city. He wanted to leave Chang and city since Ning Ke pulled out his cutlass, but not in this way. The black wind rolled up the Abbey Dean's body and continued to dance. The huge stones in the lake outside the south city gate were blown into a mess. Even the broken stone array tactics could not stop Ning Ke's cutlass wind. There was a lake for miles south of the city. The hurricane swept over and the lake water was rolled up like rain. The Abbey Dean's body fell heavily on the lakeside. The clean lake water fell down and washed away some of the filth on his body. A few fishes landed on the ground beside him, struggling with their tails. The hurricane created by Ning Ke's cutlass continued to move south. The lakeside gradually became quiet and the sky became clear. The Abbey Dean opened his eyes and looked at the blue sky. His lips moved slightly as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. He turned his head to look at the fish struggling in the puddle. The fish struggled for a while and finally accepted their fate and died. The Abbey Dean looked at the dead fish and seemed to understand something. The sound of footsteps came from the lakeside. Chin Pippi knelt down in front of him. Finally done. It's inappropriate not to ask for votes at this climax. That's why. Well, I admit it. Yun Kai said today is the Consumer Rights Day and asked me to ask for votes with this reason. I don't know how to object. I'm speechless. Anyway, let's vote if you want. I'm satisfied with this paragraph and I've used all the things I prepared. I'll start to finish the questions tomorrow. It might be updated later and there might only be one chapter. Enjoy your reading. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 808. The whole world had been fighting against the Tang Empire for several months. After the Abbey Dean was killed by Ning Ke, many changes had taken place. These changes might have been accidental, but some were inevitable. On the Xiangwan Plain in the north, more than 1,000 Tang soldiers had been fighting for their lives. At the moment when they thought they were going to die, they finally saw the dust from the south and the reinforcement cavalry. The situation of the battle suddenly changed. Thousands of Tang cavalrymen from the northern battlefront army rushed to the cavalry of the Golden Tribe royal court like an avalanche. Their cold blades took away countless heads in the silent sun. The battle finally came to an end. The blood-stained meadow turned the light from the sky red. The pedao in Situilan's hand had long been broken into 2 pieces. She wiped the blood off her face and looked around the battlefield. She found that most of her subordinates had died, but she and her team had finally won. Outside the verdant canyon in the south, it was the most dangerous moment. Jun Mo held the iron sword in his hand and looked exhausted. He was like the green mountains in late autumn, quiet and beautiful, but the yellow leaves were falling. The disciples of the back of the mountain of the academy stood behind him. Looking at the dust on the field and listening to the sound of the iron hooves, they were silent and waiting for the last moment. Mu Yu reached out and held Jun Mo's empty right sleeve. Fan Yu, the 4th brother, had been fighting against the Abbey Dean's virtual sword with the river and mountain sandbox with all his cultivation. At this time, even he struggled to walk out of the iron shelter. Since they were from the same sect, they should live and die together. The cavalry of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army came to the Verdant Canyon again. During the past 7 days, the disciples of the academy had defeated the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army many times. Both they and the Divine Hall Coalition Army were tired of this scene. It would be different this time. It would probably be the last time. At this moment, the 4th brother suddenly felt that the river and mountain sandbox in his hand had become much lighter. He sensed it and was shocked to find that the virtual sword could no longer be found in the sandbox. People in front of the verdant canyon did not know what had happened in Chang'an. But there was only one possibility that the Abbey Dean's virtual sword had disappeared. That was, the Abbey Dean was dead or disabled. 4th brother was well aware of the academy's preparations in Chang'an. He knew that his senior brothers, senior sisters and youngest brother were trying their best to kill the Abbey Dean, but he did not have much hope for it. Because he was good at calculation, he could not figure out how the academy could kill the Abbey Dean no matter how hard he tried. However, at this time, the virtual sword in the river and mountain sandbox disappeared without a trace. Whether he believed it or not, it showed that something must have happened in Chang'an City. He said in a hoarse voice, "The Abbey Dean has lost." His voice was hoarse not only because of the exhaustion he felt after enduring the phantom sword for several days, but also because of his irrepressible excitement and disbelief. Everyone in the academy heard this. Silence reigned. Suddenly, Jun Mo raised his iron sword and pointed it at the field, laughing out loud. Beigong Weiyang roared with laughter as he plucked at the strings of his zither. Shiman Buhua laughed out loud and slapped his palms with the flute. The 6th brother gave a simple and honest smile and held the iron hammer in his hand tighter. Wang Qi smiled faintly. The black flowers on his temples seemed to have gained some color. Teak Mu was a woman, so she didn't know how to be heroic. She didn't smile, but her eyes were wet. The cavalrymen of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army were right in front of them. However, the academy's disciples did not seem to care. They laughed out loud and were extremely pleased. Their hearty laughter echoed in front of the verdant canyon and spread far away along the green mountains. Whether the Abbey Dean was dead or alive, and whether they could defend the verdant canyon or not, as long as Chang'an City was safe and sound, the academy and the Tang Empire could keep the last hope. They had guarded the verdant canyon for 7 days with their lives. Wasn't it for the hope? And the hope was not lost. It was in their hands. To be more precise, it was in the hands of the 4th brother. Under the puzzled gaze of his fellow disciples, the 4th brother walked to the forefront. Looking at the cavalrymen coming like iron streams and the sword light looming in the air, he raised the river and mountain sandbox. The 4th brother's face became extremely pale, and his cheeks became much thinner. He poured all his psyche power into the river and mountain sandbox. The river and mountain sandbox was a sand table, which contained the finest yellow sand. There were rivers and mountains in the sandbox, and each grain of sand was a peak and a stone bridge in the great rivers and mountains. The yellow sand danced wildly in front of the verdant canyon. The sky was covered, and the field became extremely dark. The cavalrymen of the divine halls of West Hill rushed into the yellow sand, and then got lost. From time to time, there were shrill screams and the sound of heavy objects hitting each other. After a long time, the yellow sand gradually fell. The verdant canyon returned to peace, and there were many corpses of cavalrymen and horses in the field. The river and mountain sandbox could not change the fate of the disciples of the academy. Because the Divine Hall Coalition army was ready to charge again after a little reorganization. At this moment, a soldier of the Tang Empire suddenly walked out of the vast mountains. The soldier looked very embarrassed. His hair was unkempt and his face was dirty, and he was covered with mud. His armor had been thrown into the mountain stream, and his clothes were cut into strips by the thorns in the mountains. The soldier ran to the people of the academy. He staggered all the way and almost fell several times. It could be seen that he was extremely tired, but he still ran and shouted. His voice was extremely hoarse, as if he had not drunk water for many days. But in the ears of the people of the academy, it was as clear as the clearest spring water. Wang Wu of Group B of the Scout Battalion of the Southern Army is here to help. After saying this, the soldier of the Southern Army, who had arrived at the verdant canyon first, could no longer support himself and fell heavily on the field. He kept panting and could no longer stand up. Wang Qi walked to the Tang soldier's side and quickly felt his pulse. Jun Mo solemnly bowed to the most ordinary soldier of the Tang and said, "Thank you." An ordinary scout of the Tang army could not play any role in the situation in front of the verdant canyon. For the people of the academy, the arrival of the Tang soldier meant a lot of things. The academy was the academy of the Tang Empire. The Tang Empire was the Tang Empire of the academy. No one was fighting alone. Then, another soldier of the Tang Empire came out of the mountains. Then, more soldiers walked out of the mountains and came to the field. They supported each other and cheered for their companions. They were already exhausted. When they walked out of the verdant canyon, they sat down on the ground and could no longer stand up. Even if they picked up their weapons, they could not fight the enemy. There were even a few soldiers who suddenly relaxed and fell to the ground the moment they walked out of the mountains. For the well-trained soldiers of the Tang Empire, this was unimaginable. More and more soldiers continued to walk out of the mountains and came to the verdant canyon. After walking for several days and nights without rest, they finally reached this place. The Southern Army had arrived. That was enough. It was a tired army that appeared in front of the verdant canyon. But no one dared to deny that they were a mighty army. At this moment, the sound of gongs came from the field in the south. The cavalrymen of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army looked at the Tang Army in front of the verdant canyon with complicated expressions. Some were unwilling, some were in awe. Finally, they pulled the border ropes and returned to the camp. I was too high yesterday when I poured dog's blood on the Abbey Dean, so I am in low spirits today. Plus, I reported in advance yesterday that I have some family affairs to deal with, so I only have one chapter. But it is not appropriate to write less than 2,000 words. So I will write 7,000 words on Sunday. Have a good weekend. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.